whenever you speak to anybody who truly cares about sport, it's just that connection's there straight away.
It is, and it's something like I think a lot of people derive poetry from sport, right? And it doesn't matter what sport it is. It could be football, American football, basketball, whatever. It doesn't matter. There's storytelling, there's high drama, there's everything you could want in an interesting medium. Quite frankly, is available in the sporting world. So yeah, I'm always anybody that wants to hear me talk about it for minutes to a bunch of time on end, I'm more than happy to oblige. So, when you reached out to me, I was like, "Oh, cool!" So somebody thinks the things I say isn't complete nonsense, which is always a good day in my book.
Well, that's part of it. It's part of the debate. I mean, you've got
Mhm,
teams. It's an opposed, as you say, it's poetry in motion, poetry in
mhm.
sports and athletics. Whatever sport it might be, you've got your opposing side, you've got your side. You're both doing the same thing, but you
Mhm.
both cannot stand each other for however long that game is on the weekend or whatever. And it's absolutely beautiful. I've been to so many games. I'm a big Stoke City fan back in the UK. We're in the Championship now, well, barely still. But being a big Stoke City fan, like you give the away fans shit, you give the players shit, and blah blah blah, all in good faith. Well, I suppose it might not be in good faith, but in the end of the day, the full time whistle goes, and you'll go and have a drink and have a laugh, and it's like you're all there for your own, the same thing. And again, that poetry, it's just if you don't know sports, you just don't get it.
That's the true thing of it too, and I do think the football culture in Europe and obviously in England and the UK, of course, but Europe as a wider collective is a lot more, I think, territorial and invested than a lot of the sports here in the U.S. I think there's a lot of issues why that is. The main is that here in the U.S. it's a lot of transactional fandom. I think, right? And
How does that work?
yeah. So basically, I look at it this way. I was recently working on some research for a piece about the Premier League, right? And you talk to fans and you do the research on the clubs and stuff, and they're institutions locally, right? Like you have the four London clubs in the Prem, and they're institutions in London, and the same thing for other cities throughout England, right? In the U.S., if your team is bad and you want a new stadium, and the local taxpayers aren't trying to pay for that because maybe your team isn't doing well, you could just say, well, that's cool, Jacksonville, Florida. I'm going to relocate my team to Baltimore because the city of Baltimore is willing to pay for that. And so it becomes a lot more transactional, right? And I think part of that is the nature of the system, but also just the overarching hooks that capitalism has had into American sports. And I think that you're experiencing a little bit of that in Premier League right now with more American ownership, bringing some of those ideas across the pond. But I think at its core, what you described, when I lived in Detroit, we didn't have an MLS team. Obviously, the inferior American football system, but we didn't have an MLS team, but we had a division below that. And they, again, are in this little suburban town tucked away, this little stadium that seats about 6 to 7 thousand people. And people are just, into it. They do marches to the match, they go to a couple of hot spots after the match. And, it's until you experience it, you really don't understand. And my sister got into it and she started experiencing it. She's like, "Oh, this is awesome. I love this." And now she's a season ticket holder and goes to matches every Saturday. So that's the power of it, right?
I mean, it has that power depending on where you are. And obviously, what is a getaway? That weekend, when you can go, you're a season ticket holder, you can get away from everything that's going on, all the struggles that might be going on in day to day life. And then you've got this one thing that you can go to. It plays a massive factor into that passion behind it. And the UK is a lot smaller country, but to compare that to, say, one of the best footballing nations in the world, Brazil, and it's to them, it's not just a hope, it's a dream, it's a be all and end all. You're playing soccer, football around the favelas, and then that drives that passion. People will literally kill each other over the game.
They do. And so, funny story. I used to live. So, I have two things that came to my mind as you were saying that. So, I'll go one by one. But when I used to live in the Middle East, that's where I graduated high school. I lived in Jordan. And obviously, if you're in any country outside of the US and Canada, football is the number one sport. And I remember there was this big patch of empty land that was unclaimed, and it was just rocks everywhere. And this community of teenagers just kind of got together, started removing all these rocks, and made them into makeshift kind of sidelines, and created a pitch. Right? It was obviously just dirt or whatever, but it was good enough, and they started investing their own money and got proper posts and everything, and there was just like a whole thing, and they ended up creating like this little neighborhood league. And that's the power of it, because and that was a city that very poor, right? When you're talking low income, especially the sport of football is a very working class sport historically, and that's how it started. Whereas I think a
Well, there's
couple
no
of correct me if
boundaries. There's no boundaries to it whatsoever. You just need a
right,
ball and
yeah,
that's
you
it.
grab a
You don't need a
ball and then you
post.
just kick it around. Exactly. And so they created this league, this community league, and it got intense. Like they're going after each other. There's no money in it. It's just for fun, right? All to escape that whole dynamic of maybe you're having trouble eating enough food that week, or you're having trouble at school, or the job is annoying, whatever the case may be. It was a little bit of a release. And I thought of that when I was recently recalling a moment in my life. So I wrote about this a couple weeks ago, but uh, in 2021, I was in a really bad personal situation, like a really toxic romantic relationship, right? And that year was in the NBA in basketball. The team I support, the New York Knicks, were coming back, and they had this magical season, super unexpected, made it to the playoffs, but were bounced pretty early, so didn't win anything of substance. But for me, I always look back at that team as this was the 2-3 nights a week where I could decompress from everything and watch a basketball game for 3 hours, right? And to me, that's the power of it. That's to be able to connect with, quite frankly, you're connecting and watching multimillionaires play a game, right? And that's at its core what it is. But when you're in it and you're watching all the games, like in football, obviously you guys have close to 40 games a year. I think in the championships even more than that. And in basketball, it's 82, so it's a lot more, but it's the same concept, right? Where it gives you a few hours to immerse yourself and then be surrounded by people who have equal passion to what you have. And you see it across all sports. And regardless of how rich these leagues get, I think that's the foundation of why we keep coming back.
Definitely. I mean, you probably found just as much as I have that you also get the opposite. In fact, where it can be a massive blessing and a massive curse supporting your team. I've had it. So more recently, I travel all the way around. I'm not in the UK in the moment. I'm in Australia, and I was a season ticket holder at Stoke City for so long. And then coming across the world, I'd rarely got to see them. We saw a massive, massive dive in the whole of the area of Stoke-on-Trent when we got relegated from the Premier League. A massive dive in economic balance and economic growth. It just dropped completely off the face of the map, equal to the amount that it grew and rose when we made it to the Premier League. But the effect that it had on me personally was when I was watching these games week in, week out, that result, which to me, having very little say in what actually happens and how they play, it's a toss of a coin whether or not my weekend's going to be good or it's going to be bad. So yes, it can be that massive great escape, and you can get there and you do the good times and bad times, be there sitting next to the same people, the season ticket holders, and a cold Thursday night in Stoke, cold Tuesday night in Stoke, as you've probably heard. And it can be amazing, but at the same time, I found the more I get away from my local team, and I still love sport in general, no matter what the team, whatever the relation I have to them, or whatever the game is, I love it anyway for that passion and that story. But the further I can get away from a Stoke game and Stoke result, a lot of the time, the happier and more positive my week goes because of that. Which is just crazy to think about to me, but it works so much in that regard, where it will try and suck me in. It will always try and suck me in because I know we'll be playing shit. We are in a terrible season, and I'll just always check the scores anyway when the game's on, as I've always done. If I see we win 4 or 5 games in a row, and we're maybe 2 or 3 points off the playoffs, I'm looking at this thing now thinking, oh shit. It's the hope that kills you.
Yeah, you could argue the the bad times are what formulate this almost sense of belonging with one another, for one, but also you also start looking at other people who fan in a different way. Like I'll use a Premier League example. Like you could see somebody who supports Manchester City, right? Obviously, a club that's always at the top of the table, always winning trophies, always spending a lot of money. And you're just like, well, I'm a real fan because my team is, struggling, mid table, whatever. And you don't know what it's like. But at the same time, when you get those 5, 6, 7 wins in a row, you get that success, or if Stoke was to get advanced into the Premier League again, you would
Wouldn't hold my
just kind
breath.
of be, well, hold your breath for that, right? Um, you'll be like, I was here for that, right? And I was like, it happened to a friend of mine recently who's a Newcastle supporter. Obviously, they recently had a big influx of money in ownership, which feel however you will about trust funds and different type of money coming in to the sport. That's whatever, but he was like, hey, we have a chance to buy players, we could be good again, and so he's been a part of that journey. And I see it a lot in here in the US with American football. Where I used to live in Detroit, their team, the Lions, have been a shit franchise for 50 years, right? They have not been good. Before this year, where they advanced very far in the playoffs, they had had any level of success for almost 30 years. So I do people who were in their 30s, in their entire lives, they've been following this team. They've had nothing, nothing but misery, garbage, bad ownership. And then all of a sudden you have this magical season, and it's that much more magical. It's almost like eating a steak dinner, right? Like if you had this awesome fillet, and you've never had a fillet for like 3 years, and then you finally have one, it's amazing. But if you have it like every week or twice a week, you're kind of like, whatever. This is just what I eat. And that's where the weird psychology of it all, of fandom, kind of really comes into play, because you may be disconnected, but once that success hits, you're like, well, I'm back in, I'm ready to be heard again, so to speak. And that's the crazy thing about it, because we don't do that with anything else. Like if you see I'll use like movies as an example. Like M. Night Shyamalan is obviously a real famous director. A lot of times I'm a little leery about his movies because sometimes they're really good or sometimes they're really bad. But
Yeah.
I don't have an emotional attachment to M. Night Shyamalan one way or another. But I have an attachment to a team I support, and it's an interesting thing about how it creates these hooks that never leave. And I almost sometimes, like right now, I'm watching my basketball team, the New York Knicks, in the playoffs. Every game is close. Every game is a heart attack. And I was just like, the other day, I was like, how great must it be not to have put yourself through this? Like, Bailey, I was literally the waning moments of this game. I was standing around my living room pacing like an idiot, and when things went wrong, I like got really mad. And it's just like it's like, how have I allowed? Like, I'm a rational human being. How have I allowed this to happen? But it happens. It's just crazy.
The exact same. I mean, I am the exact same. And it's just, there's nothing rational about it. You literally, we say we bleed red and white, Stoker red and white straps, we bleed red and white. And it'll cut you deep, and it does cut you deep. Coming to the national team is even more so, because I remember so vividly during, I don't know if you watched the Euros, the European Championships.
So I have a funny anecdote about that as well. I was living in Detroit at the time, and England was in the final, if I recall, and there was the whole "bring it home" thing, and
Yeah.
it's coming home, that whole like campaign. And so a friend of mine was like, "Hey, there's this pub specifically for football in downtown Detroit." I'm like, "Oh, sounds awesome!" So we go there. So it's a Liverpool pub, so a lot of Liverpool supporters in there, and we're watching, and the environment is crazy. And of course, it doesn't pan out the way anyone wanted it to, but you saw it. Every movement, every pass, every dribble, every shot. People were at the edges of their seats. They're standing up. Beer is flying everywhere. It was just packed, and there's not a lot of things in life anymore that gets people that fired up. And I think that's one of the important things, right? Especially when you're talking nationally. See, here in America, it's weird because our U.S.
All
men's
your
national
sports
team.
are made. All your sports are just American sports, practically. Yes, there's obviously Russian influence and like Eastern European with basketball and ice hockey and whatnot as well. But
Yeah.
when you guys, it's always been a thing for people in the UK when they hear an American team or an American person say, or a supporter of their team say, we're the world champions. I was like, what do you mean? You're the national champions. By
Yeah,
extension, yes, you probably are the world champions because you're the best at that sport. But it's like me saying that I'm a million times better at you at being English. I can't do anything else about that.
Yeah, that was a big controversy last year, I think, where they were like, "Oh, the NBA champion is the world champion," and a U.S. track and field star was like, "Well, you're not playing against the world, so how are you the world champion?" And it's a fair point. And there is a little bit of, I feel like, American arrogance when it comes to sports, because I've had this theory, and every American friend of mine hates me for it, but I'll throw it at you, and maybe you'll find some sense in it. I have been told that I might have been a European in a past life, but um, so basically, I always say Americans love sports that they're good at because America loves winning. That's their thing, right? They love to say, "Hey, we're the best country," blah blah blah, right? So they love American football. They're the only country that plays it. 99% of the NFL's player population is American sport.
It's called American football.
Yeah, exactly. It's the name of the sport, right? Um, they like basketball because our Olympic team with all the NBA stars routinely wins the gold medals at the Olympics, right? But I find they hate association football or real football, as everyone else in the world calls it, and they don't really like ice hockey anymore, and they're weaning off of baseball. What's the common thread? Other countries have gotten better. Japan in baseball, Latin America in baseball. You look at even in basketball, like the Eastern European bloc countries, they're starting to get a lot better. But you look at football, the U.S. has always been inferior, unless you talk about the women's game, which they've always been done really well.
Yeah.
Shocking that people love the U.S. women's national team, can't name a single player on the men's one. We're front runners. This is what we do, So I just feel like it's how I've always felt. Where, and again, I get a lot of pushback. They're like, "Well, if I don't find the game interesting, it's not because America isn't good at it." I was like, "Well, you don't have your American hero, right?" And it's why the NBA has been in a little bit of trouble because all the best players now are European. Your best play, your top 10 players in the league, I'd say 7 of them are probably from Europe. And
see, this is where I'd see that cycle kind of churning purely based on the fact that, yes, I think what you're saying is correct. Not to America's detriment or fault. I mean, that American arrogance is what makes America so great in the first place. And you wouldn't have those. You can't take the good without the bad in terms of, yes, you love these sports that you're great at, you become great at these sports, and then if you weren't that arrogant and literally fanatic about those sports, then you wouldn't be so good at them in the first place. But then because of also America being America, and you've got the wider media always pointing, or the Western media is just pointing straight at the US, that especially throughout the Jordan era, where it was finally that sort of televised and they were global stars for the first time, it wasn't just Americans who were seeing these athletes and thinking, I want to do that. It was the rest of the world, a lot of Europe doing the same thing. So it's, again, the benefit, well, the pros, you say the top 8, was it, or top 10 players in the NBA are now European?
Yeah, like I would say, like you look at the MVP race that just happened in the NBA, the top 5 players who got MVP votes, so most valuable player, the best player in the league. The guy who won it is from Serbia. The second place guy is from Canada. The third place guy is from Slovenia. And the fourth place guy is from Greece. And the fifth place guy is US. So there's this clamoring in basketball, especially for the next great American star. It's not just the next great star, it's the next great American star, because they feel it's like a marketability thing. And it's a weird thing, it's this, I kind of argue it's a little xenophobic, because you see a baseball player getting interviewed in their native tongue, typically a Hispanic player, and they're going to be like, oh, I hate how this guy can't learn English. You're playing ball in America, you need to learn English. But I think about it all the time. Like in Europe in football, like you look at like maybe a team like Real Madrid or PSG, one of these like high big spending teams, they're going to get a player from Spain, from Argentina, from Brazil, from England, from Italy, wherever the talent is from, and they'll figure out the language barrier later. So a lot of times these guys on these teams, they speak a bunch of languages because they have to. Whereas Americans here, we're kind of like learn the language or die, and it's just kind of like, okay, but can we be a little more inclusive? That would be nice.
Yeah. Well, that's what we had with the Premier League in particular, is that because the Premier League is the wealthiest football league in the world, and the reason it's the wealthiest is because it's English speaking, and the most countries speak English as opposed to other languages other than their own. We've got all this money and all this funding where, if you look at the top teams, it's only more recently now, because of rules that they've brought in, that there are more and more English players, where you've now got to have X amount of players from the academy, you've got to have X amount of English players in your whole squad, and you can't just go out and buy anymore. And because of that, this is one of the great things that Man City do really, really well, which is why you're seeing a lot of really good English talent coming through that Man City team, is that they invested even though, say what you want about them, say you love them, hate them, say they bought the league and the cheating or whatever you want to say, regardless of any of that stuff, they have invested really heavily in their academy, and they have got the best academy system in the world, which is something I do want to touch on later on in terms of that progression through youth levels of any sport. Europe versus USA in particular, it's just completely wildly different how you have your system through high school games, college games, going into the pro league, and with the draft as well, which I believe is there to make it fair. Whether it works that way or not, you'll have to tell me. But we see that from, again, the Premier League, multinational in terms of where the players come from and coming in. You've often got players who run around who don't speak a word of English, and they've got translators on the training field with them. But again, the sport itself is universal. It has no language.
That's the beauty of any sport, right? Is that you could learn it, and then it just becomes, regardless of your background, nationality, whatever the case may be, it's the great unifier. I remember, like, I brought up PSG earlier. I always was so annoyed because, like, I was like, well, France has a lot of great talent. They do well at World Cups and Euros and stuff like that, generally speaking. Why is the best and most lucrative team in France not buying French players? I thought it was just so weird, and I'm just like, why wouldn't you want to have, like, you would think, like, locally Parisians would like that, maybe. I mean, they're a weird bunch, we know that. But you would think that they would want to say, hey, here's this local, like they recently, I think a year or two ago, brought in Ousmane Dembele from Barcelona, who's native French, and like, I think that was a home run from a PR perspective because here's our homegrown son, and watch how awesome he is every week when you watch PSG play. And I think
It doesn't really work that well. It doesn't really work that way within football, especially in Europe, because with these, it does when you're looking at lower levels and lower tier teams who aren't in the Champions League, so if they aren't in the major European competition. But PSG, with all the funding they've had, they've not won a Champions League.
Yep.
And to them, it doesn't matter who you've got. The Champions League's the main goal. It doesn't matter where the nationality is from. There's a great example within the English League for Wolverhampton Wanderers, so Wolves. Wolves, I don't know if you followed beforehand, but they had a massive, massive Portuguese influence, where they had a few managers back-to-back who were Portuguese, and they had all the connections in Portugal, and they were bringing all the best experienced, older Portuguese players and youthful Portuguese players through as well. And the whole team was effectively Portugal, to the point where they decided to run with it on a PR standpoint, where their third kit was literally made to look exactly like the Portuguese team, the Portuguese national team colours, because that's where they ran with it. But the PR in terms of nationality, that national pride within football, isn't so much there anymore. As long as you can do well in European football, you're going to do amazing. Where PSG they'll get whoever they want there. Where especially we are saying the locals a lot of the time in Paris do want that French element to come through. there was a lot, I mean, a lot of backfiring on the likes of Neymar and Messi being at PSG when they were, where yes, they did great in terms of they're just great players, they'll always do amazing. But they were on massive wages, humongous wages. And then on top of that, they the ultras, as we call them, so the hardest, biggest, most devoted fans, were just not on their side at all. No matter how well they did, no matter how many goals they scored, they cost way too much, and the locals didn't feel like they cared that they were there. And these are some of the best names in the entire sport ever. So it's a real toss of a coin.
It's tough, right? Because if you aren't like the French person's perspective is probably like, even if you don't live in Paris, if you live in another city in France, regardless, so you're probably thinking like, this Argentinian and this Brazilian, they don't understand what it means, and they don't understand what it means to play at this venue, and they don't understand what this or that means. They don't understand the history, and you see that, the more established a club becomes, the more that it becomes prevalent. And there's a little bit of tribalism, I think, with sports, right? Where there's a connectivity that you like to see. And we see it here in the US. Like, if there's a basketball player and I'll give you an example. His name is Anthony Edwards. He plays in Minnesota, right? So in the northern part of the Midwest. And he's originally from Atlanta, Georgia, which is from the southern part of the country. And people who are from Atlanta, I watch him a lot because he's their native son, right? He's like us. He's from Georgia. He's Atlanta. He looks like me, whatever. And there's something to that. And I think in European football, you get on a much grander scale because of national pride. And I mean, the flip of that, to use your Wolves example, I mean, I wonder if there's any data on how much viewership increase they got from Lisbon after they kind of made that increase. So kind of, I think it speaks to the globalization of it, right? Where there's this tug and pull between supporters wanting to be true to history and identity, but leagues and clubs, at the end of the day, they want to make money. That's their primary goal. The guys at PSG, they want to go deeper in the Champions League because that means more money, right? They obviously want to win trophies because to put in the trophy case, but ultimately, you're in it to win money and to accrue more funds. And so you'll see leagues expand as much as they could possibly expand. It's why European football clubs play friendlies in the U.S., right? They're trying to increase the footprint. So on the flip side, it's why the NFL and the NBA host games in Europe because they want to get that audience. And I'm in a group chat full of UK and European-based basketball fans. It's working. They're into it. And now you have their players kind of coming over, so there's a cross-pollination. And it's just this tug and pull, though, because you think about, like, I talked to an older Arsenal fan who's kind of like, oh, I missed good old days when it was just all these guys, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, it's a different day and age, and things are changing
Like,
because they're
grow
going
up a little bit.
Right. Yeah. We're not in 94 anymore. It's just like, it's different now. And there is the money aspect, and some people think it taints it. But I think most people tend to look past it 95% of the time, and it's a tough reality because at the end of the day, they are going to try and make money because if they didn't make money, you wouldn't have a sport to watch because who's funding it, so that's kind of the ultimate push and pull that you have with teams and sports and leagues and the whole dynamic. And I think the globalization is a good thing ultimately. I've always this is another stupid example from my childhood, but I remember when I was in grade school, we did like this international pen pal program. This is, long before America became incredibly xenophobic and afraid of every other country. And I had a pen pal that was in Brazil, and everybody it was like this program that the school was doing, and it was cool, understanding how this person's day to day goes and how much different it was than mine, and vice versa. And I think that's a good thing. The internet, of course, has made the world smaller. You mentioned at the top, you're in Australia, I'm in Seattle, different sides of the world, and here we are chatting, right? And it's a magical thing. It's a good thing, and you get to find more like-minded individuals. But at the same time, you have those old habits in your mind, just like, man, this is cool, but I really wish Stoke had a few more Englishmen and not as many German guys, for example, so it's it's an interesting dynamic that I don't think is going away anytime soon. The nationalistic element is always going to be there with people, but I think that's why you have national football, right? You have Euros, you have the World Cup, you got stuff like that, so that kind of satiates that appetite, even if it's not might not be there at the club level.
So where do you feel that the money side of things will go eventually? Because it just seems to everybody who's involved in any sport that there just is no cap whatsoever. Because it doesn't match inflation, it just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. And we're seeing now deals like for Mbappe, there's a Saudi deal to go over, and how much was it he was supposed to earn within 1 year? Like,
it was over 150 million. I feel like
I think it was way more than that. I think it was a lot, but then
it was like 250 or something. Like it was like a quarter of a billion.
Obviously, the Saudi league's slightly different because they're quite happy to
Saudi league, Bailey.
They're quite happy to throw a lot of money at it wastefully, just as PR for the whole country is the way that I kind of see it, and that's the way it kind of comes across to everybody who's not completely oblivious, because everyone knows they're not going over there because it's not just obviously soccer, football. It's also golf as well with the LIV.
Live, yeah,
yeah, with Live, and they're quite happy to lose a lot of money for the sake of getting people to see that, or to almost accept Saudi Arabia and all these areas as part of the emerging modern world.
It's a topic I have a lot of opinions on because I used to live in the Middle East, and so I lived in Jordan, which is not an oil country, not rich by any stretch of the imagination. And we would in the summer get a lot of people coming from Saudi, from Qatar, Bahrain, all the Gulf countries that had a lot of money, and they would come and spend their summers in Jordan because where they're from is too hot. It's just a little not as hot, but you interact with all these people, and the sports washing thing is a very real thing where they're trying to have people look past human rights violations, equality violations in their countries.
Well, just a quick note on that, and I don't know whether or not you've heard this beforehand, but in the running to the Qatar World Cup that just happened, at one point years ago when it was just announced and they were building all the stadiums, there was a very, very high percentage of people who were making the stadiums who had died in the creation of those stadiums in terms of relation to the whole population. And it's just, again, like you were saying, those standards are scary.
They don't exist. There was a really good here in the U.S. ESPN, which is our main sports televised provider, had a real in-depth analysis look at that, at the conditions that the workers were living in, and the way that they just weren't taken care of. And because they wanted to build it so fast, they just dumped a bunch of money on FIFA's doorstep. And FIFA, of course, being the corrupt organization that it can be, said, sure thing, more money, awesome, let's do it. Yeah, we'll do it in the wintertime. We'll readjust the schedule because it's way too hot to play there in the summer. And my family members kind of pushed back on me because I was super critical about it. It's like, well, this is a great moment for Arab pride. This is a great moment for highlighting the region. And I was like, if you really wanted to highlight the region, you should have just done it across multiple countries, because like they did a couple countries, but you want to do it across like the entire Middle East, because that would highlight the region a lot better. And instead, what you had, it came off as to anybody in the West, was this country trying to hide its sins, right? And that's the bad. To back to your original point about the money stuff and how it affects the way we look at sports and everything. Yeah, I mean the Saudi Pro League, the Qatar World Cup, it's all made in an effort to boost tourism to those countries, right? It's done with a very clear purpose in mind. And I think a lot of times as sports fans, we ignore a lot of stuff. Here in the US, especially, I can account for a player deals with domestic violence allegations. A lot of times, if they're playing well, most fans will look over that. There's all types of crime related stuff that we tend to overlook when it comes to our favorite teams and our favorite players, right? And But this is one where an entire country is trying to eradicate the viewpoint of it on the global stage. And I remember during the World Cup, you would see a lot of like, I don't want to call them propaganda, but it felt like propaganda commercials for why you should invest money in Qatar. Why you should build a branch for your business here. And it felt like it feels manipulative in a way, right? Because you obviously want to find ways to boost tourism, right? But you being a Saudi Arabian and saying, hey, we have Cristiano Ronaldo now, come visit Saudi Arabia. It comes off a little weird. And, to the players who accept the money, they feel like mercenaries. And ultimately, the league is never going to be a high end competitive league. It's in a sense kind of like the Chinese league, right? Where it's like, here's a bunch of money, bring us all your washed up players.
Well, the MLS
And
used to be seen as that retirement home for European players for so long.
That's another thing that gets on my nerves, Bailey. I remember thinking about this
Oh,
a
I'm
while
sorry.
ago. No, it's just like I want the MLS to be good. Okay, I want them to do good because I feel like there is a genuine interest on the youth level in football
It's
here
getting
in
there.
the
It
US.
is definitely getting there.
Because there's a reason. A lot of parents are afraid of American football because of the head trauma stuff.
Yeah.
That all that stuff has come out. Basketball is still going to be popular, whatever, but football is, easily accessible, like we've talked about, and, it not as much risk of very severe brain injuries, which is kind of a big deal. So the MLS, I always feel like they could be one of two leagues. You're never going to be the Prem. You're never going to be La Liga, right? The high end
It's just too
European
far
leagues.
away from everything that's going on, and
Exactly.
it could be. It's the level that's there and the background, the infrastructure that's there. It very well could be, but not in a capacity where you want to be able to get over every week, and for the fans as well, because in the end of the day, it's driven by the fans, and if the fans can't get there for the games, it doesn't matter how much money it brings in, then you're going to end up losing a lot of that homegrown respect.
Absolutely. And I always thought from a player perspective, they had two routes to go. So they're not going to be a top end league. We know that. You could be the Chinese league or the Saudi league. Here's a bunch of money to old players, or you could be like the French league, which outside PSG has a lot of great academies and they develop a lot of local talent who end up getting sold to other teams down the line when they're ready. But that's how those companies those clubs kind of operate. So,
Well, you say it
but
right.
they
Companies, not clubs, companies. You're
I
dead
guess it
right.
wasn't a mistake, right? But ultimately, I'm just like, they can't decide which one they want to do because they'll go, hey, look at all this awesome American talent we've developed. But then on the other hand, here's Lionel Messi. It's just like, it's like, what do you want to be? And that's what frustrates me about the MLS. Plus, on top of that, they don't have a relegation system. They don't play at the same time as the European leagues. So you're not even looked at in the same breath. You're looked at as inferior because of those differences. But because you play in America, you think that, well, this is how all the American things do. They have like, sort of a salary cap. They don't really, like I said, there's no promotion or relegation system. So it's a closed league, even though there are other football leagues within the U.S. There's the USL, which is a step below the MLS, and then NISA, which is a step below them. So that's like the third division.
Here's my thoughts on why I believe that to be the case, which something you may not have hear much in America anyway, because it's a closed off league, yes. It seems there's a lot of control and a lot of power at the top. No one's allowed to enter. The governing body is not there for the game. The governing body is there for its members more than anything else. Where we have in the UK, anyone can start a team. I've started teams. Yes, you've got local teams, but there is an actual route from local teams to develop up the ladder to get to higher and higher levels, further and further down the line. In American sports, because of how that system works, it's great for developing amazing talent from an early stage, and if you can see a very direct route there. So as a player, it's great because you go to play at school, you play at high school, you play at college, and you pretty much follow the whole way. And if you're tapped on the shoulder to say, yeah, you're the one kind of thing, then you can see that in front of you, and it's a very valid path to follow. Very investable. Lots of money to be made when you can invest in players further down the line, regardless of the luck that you may have or may not have. Whereas in football and sports around Europe, and especially it's all South America as well, it's just not there. You don't have that development. It's just a massive pool, and the scouting system within these sports in Europe in particular, it makes no difference. Like for them, it's complete luck that this scout is there at the right time to see you play on that one day, and you could be good, you could be bad. No one's tracking your stats from a teenager. No one's looking at all your stats and looking at how you are game to game. They'll look at your attitude, and they'll look at how you develop and how you play, and they'll speak to some of your coaches, but there's no money ball behind it. It's that is the great American way now since Moneyball, is that statistics, the numbers that we can count around it, and then because you've got that with the American game, it's great to bring players to that level. And if you did get involved, or if America itself got involved in soccer on a higher basis, a higher level, it'd be great for the country, and you'd create some great talent. But without that bigger pool of starting players being able to come in and everywhere else to challenge, because you need competition, because competition is what drives that progression. It's what drives better and better players, because it's an open field where anyone can come in and different teams can come in and they can spend whatever money they want to without those kind of salary caps. It forces other teams to raise as well, because if they don't, they're just going to drop off. Where the salary caps that they have in America, so I do want to get your opinion on how that works, particularly for America, and what that could mean for the Premier League. But the dynamics of the game are so wildly different that I don't think on a skill level we're ever going to be at the same place at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's another element there, which is the options that are presented to young American teenagers. Right? There's so many sports now. There's so many different avenues, and some kind of proliferate, others kind of fall by the wayside. In terms of the salary cap, the Premier League one is an interesting one, because if you look at the proposals now, there's really only one team that will be punished by the proposal that they have currently, and that's Chelsea, because they just spend and spend and spend and don't do anything. So uh, the idea from what I was reading was that basically the revenue that the bottom of the Premier League would get times 5 is what the salary cap and spending would be. The idea, of course, being, there's spending limits placed in La Liga. La Liga has that right now on a per club basis. And I think the idea is that there's so much money in the Premier League, especially at the top 6, right? And those are going to be, they're just going to spend and spend and spend and spend, and it becomes reckless. And you want to maybe kind of rein that in a little bit. Seems to be the general consensus. Now,
well, we do have something similar at the moment, but it's kind of still built in order to benefit the top clubs, where we do have financial fair play.
Yeah.
It's not very open. No one knows exactly how it works. It'd be great if the public, the one way that would resolve all of the issues of everything that goes on with backhanders and money being misplaced and overspent and whatnot, would be if all clubs had to be public about their spendings and their financials. It'd solve it all straight away. You haven't got to change any rule. It'd solve it all instantly. However, so how financial fair play is supposed to work is that you're only allowed to spend X amount relative to how much you bring in. Mm-hmm. So you've got to you can't just run at a loss in order to pump it up higher and higher for other means and other purposes, such as, say, Saudi brand deals and whatnot, and what's working over there. You've got to be able to bring it in. So therefore, the incentive is, regardless of how much you spend, you've still got to compete. Because if you're not competing and you're not doing well, then you're not going to get the TV deals, the money deals. You're not going to get extra TV time, and you're not going to be able to sustain that for long. Which is why the Premier League's massively skewed for that compared to lower leagues. It kind of hinders lower leagues more and more because they don't get that TV time. So that's the way I see it.
There's a increasing erosion of the middle class, right, in European football, I think. Where there's always talks of this Super League thing, and so you got your big earners at the top. In England, you could argue it's fairly more competitive than other ones. So, you look at Germany's been a 1 to 2 club league forever. Italy's the same way, 3 club league. France is a 1 club league, with PSG. So, and Spain has been generally kind of dominated by Real Madrid, Atletico, and Barcelona over the past couple of decades, and so it's in that sense more competitive, but still those lower tier clubs. There's a big gap, right, in between the profitability of an Arsenal or a Liverpool versus everybody else, and the salary cap thing here in the U.S. is a lot more simple, right? It's there's every team in the league is going to have a revenue sharing agreement that they come up with. Typically it's like 51 or 52% for team owners. The rest goes to the players, for salaries and such, and it's all based on merchandise sales, TV deals, streaming deals, that sort of thing. And every team has the same amount of money. So if there's 32 teams in the league, they get a 32 piece pie, right? Everybody spends the same amount of money. It's intended to keep parity. But the downside is because you have closed leagues, there is no consequence for being shit, right? So, like,
It is not.
in the NFL, for example, the Cleveland Browns were a really bad team with really poorly run ownership for multiple years, and they're not punished. And if anything, they're rewarded by the draft system, where in most leagues it's going to be the worst team picks from the best pool of players. And the benefit of the draft system is that you get a whole big pool of college players to pick from, and the bad teams get in theory, the better prospects. Obviously, there's misevaluations, and you think a player is going to be great, and he doesn't turn out to be so great, so that happens. But that's the intent. The NFL more so.
To
go
me,
ahead,
that screams it's just a gentleman's club of all the owners of these leagues.
Yeah,
where
it is.
They are all in this club, and then no one comes in, no one leaves, and for over time, as the deals get bigger and bigger, every single person within that infrastructure just gets wealthier and wealthier. And it's not so much the fans that don't benefit from that, because as a fan, yes, you'll get your turn. Like you were mentioning about the team earlier who hadn't had success in 30 years. You get a great draft pick. The only example to mind now for saying the NBA with Michael Jordan comes in, and then great, your whole fortunes turn around for a decade afterwards, for so long afterwards. Or if you're very lucky, the legacy that goes from that afterwards. But the only sort of part of that pie that I feel like suffers from that, if anything, is the players. Because yes, you can say people. I absolutely hate the argument that players get paid way too much, and we're just watching millionaires run around. Not because they're not millionaires, and the money's one side of things, and it's maybe seen a bit differently in America than it is in the UK, especially with football and other sports. But at the end of the day, nobody ever gets that good unless they're so passionate and driven and committed to that sport. The reason they get paid so much is because that many people want to do it and they are desired that much. If not, they wouldn't get paid so much, which is why we're seeing that massive turnover going through the roof over in recent times. But if you're a great player in a good American college and you want to be able to compete for titles, you want to get the championship, you want the rings, and that's been your goal for so long, and you effectively have no real choice of where to go. You could be a beach-born person who loves the sun over in California, and you could be sent to Detroit. And it's like, what do you do? That's your life, your family, your whole life. And it's like, what, you've got to do that or else you can't play the sport that you love? Where in the UK and sports around Europe, it doesn't matter. You could be the best player in the world and you could decide, screw it, I'm going to go here because I want to. It happens so many. I remember a great example was Carlos Tevez at one point where he was very controversial at the time during the World Cup in 2010, I think it was. He was supposed to be in the Argentinian team, and he's one of the great strikers they had. And he was supposed to be in that team for the World Cup, and actually got to the final that year as well, and where they could have used him, they could have won. But instead he decided, and he turned around to his whole nation and said, I'm not going to go to the World Cup because I'm tired from playing the whole season, and I'm going to go play golf and go to Disneyland with my family instead. It's like, everyone's having a go at him, slating because you need to do this, as if because you're a player and because you're earning so much that you need to go and do these things for other people, when that argument is a lot of people forgetting that they are people. They're people with lives, and if they don't want to do it, they shouldn't have to. Where, let's say me or you are a player, let's just take two examples. Let's say we both came through at a college level, and you were the number 1 pick, I was the number 2 pick. You should be able to go to the best. And yes, obviously you've got the trades and whatnot that work around it. You don't really have much of a choice. But your options are all yours as a soccer player. If you don't want to go somewhere, you don't have to go somewhere. If you don't want to stay somewhere, you don't have to stay somewhere. You've got a lot more control, and you've got a lot more value, especially nowadays with the media and the branding of players in particular, where it never used to be that. It used to always be team over player, but now the brand of the player is massive influence over deals, TV deals, players that they sign, the numbers that they wear, the shirt deals as well. And to me, it just seems unfair.
Yeah, so the American perspective on this is that we are incredibly addicted to the concept of parity. And we want there's this whole like fear that if you did that, then every single player would go to New York, LA, Miami, all the quote unquote glamour markets, because there's a lot of not so glamorous markets here that have professional teams. I'm sure most basketball players aren't going to be rushing to go play in Indiana, or Oklahoma City, and I think that's the big fear that they have with that level of player empowerment, which I think
People would. I'm sorry, but I feel like that's a massive lie. I feel that's a lie that's been toted. I feel that's a lie that's been toted by the club, by the organizations themselves. Like they're going to turn around and say, look, if we don't have parity, it's not going to be fair. It's like, well, what's not fair is that no one's allowed in, no one's allowed out. Players don't get to choose where they're going. And if you don't like it, you're going to move the club to another city, to another state.
Mm-hmm. Here's the worst part too, Bailey, is that the collective bargaining agreements that the players' unions negotiate with the leagues, they always do it in the vein of a small market team being able to retain a player for as long as possible. So I'll use the NBA as an example. When you sign as a first-round draft pick in the NBA, you typically sign a 4-year deal with a 5th-year option. So that 5th-year option is a club option. So if you're playing well, they're going to exercise the club option. You're on the books for another year. If you're shit, they're just going to go decline the option. You're now a free agent. Go wherever you want. But if you're a really good star player, they're always going to exercise the option. So that's 5 years. And that team that drafted you also has something called bird rights, which means that they could offer you more than any other team in free agency. So the player is always going to take the money. I would never blame the player for taking the money. You never know when an injury is going to happen and derail your career. Take the money. But the issue becomes, it's just like they become locked in. So even if they wanted to play, maybe they're from the South and they want to play for New Orleans, a team that plays in New Orleans or something, but they're drafted to a team in Portland, they're incentivized to stay with that team in Portland. And the reason that they made these machinations in the collective bargaining was so that a smaller, quote, small market team can't complain like, oh, we never get any players. All of our players are requesting trades to LA and New York and so on and so forth. And it screws the players. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, because like you said, there are brand deals now. You don't need to. You can make money outside of it, but there's a lot of times where a player is from a certain place and he wants to play there. A great example of that is Paul George, who was drafted out of college. He's from LA. He went to college in California at Fresno State, and he entered the league. And he was a top 15 draft pick, so really highly regarded player. And he gets drafted by Indiana. And he does his time there, and is there for almost a decade. Eventually ends up getting traded to Oklahoma City. So and he's like, I don't want to play in Oklahoma. Does that for a year, and he's just like, whatever it takes to his agent, whatever it takes to get me to LA, back home. That's where I want to be.
Yeah, and they will jump through hoops to do so. They'll jump through
10
hoops,
years
and it's
for him to get there, right? It's like that's the real issue when it comes to a player and where they actually want to go.
So this is something which you don't get in soccer, which I see all the time in American sports, which is you get players at different stages of their career have their peaks. That's understandable. And sometimes something just clicks in a player's head or in their game where they all of a sudden become unplayable, and that's great. But it happens on such a level in American sports, especially NFL in particular, where older players are able to come through and be like, where have they come from? How has this happened? What's going on? Because of exactly what you've just said. A lot of them, that's the way it kind of takes a lot of, the way I see it, takes a lot of motivation out of players. They don't want to play at a club, and they know they've got to stay there for 4 years, and they've got on a stupid contract. And regardless of what goes on, it almost feels like they've got no control. But then the one thing I can see comparatively to soccer is that when you have a control of where you want to go and you get to go where you want to go, there's a lot more passion in your game. You're playing for the badge. You're playing for your club, your team. You're playing for the fans. You're playing for the area. That support, that pride is there. And if you don't give a shit, really, no one's ever going to come out and say they don't care. Well, you can tell in some players where they've got injury after injury. Is like, have you really got injury after injury? Or they're not putting it all in, or they're jumping out the way of challenges or tackles. They're not getting stuck in. They don't really care. Especially if they're in those middling to low teams. And again, you say there's no threat of relegation. They don't really want to be there. They're on the contract. And what does that mean for the fans?
That's another thing is that back to an earlier point that we both made was there isn't that same level of identity with a club and its roots in a community, right? And I used the Knicks as an example earlier. They're one of the few teams that have that because they're never going to move. Why on earth would you relocate from New York City? There's zero reason, right? So, like financially, there's zero reason. Yeah, there's zero reason. Why would you ever do it? There's no reason for you to ever leave New York City. So they're embedded into that community. However, in another market, like it's always like this weird thing, like in the NFL, the Buffalo Bills, really small town. Buffalo's not a big market. And there was like, oh, well, would the NFL ever open up a franchise in London, right? Because they've been doing all the London games and stuff. And the Bills were always the first team on that list. So so a lot of fans are jaded where they look at it as like, well, it doesn't matter how much I support them. It doesn't matter how much I do this. They're just going to move. And it goes back to your earlier point where they're just kind of an old boys club, of guys at a country club. Hey, look at my $1 billion asset I have, because NFL teams are super valuable, right? NBA teams are also valuable. Like I think 8 of the top 10 most valuable sports clubs in the world are either NBA or NFL teams. Only exception being 2 European football clubs. I think Real Madrid and one of the Premier League clubs. The name escapes me right now, but
probably Man United, more than likely.
Yeah, I think it's Man United. Yeah, so they're worth a lot of money. They generate a lot of money, and who's making that money? It's the owner, right? So an example being like if you have a club that's like the Dallas Cowboys are really high value, 10 billion plus, in valuation. Their best player, how much does he make? 30, 40 million. And to the average person, like, hey, 30, 40 million, that's a shit ton of money. But
not to them.
In the grand scheme of things of what that brand is valued at, and he is the reason why it's so valued, it becomes a situation where, yeah, you almost have to be on the player's side. Like, I never understood people like, oh, greedy player. It's like, so you are mad at the millionaire because you have loyalty to the billionaire. It's very strange. It's just like, it's almost like, here in the U.S., there's like a lot of debates about when people who worked at fast food restaurants like McDonald's getting a higher wage, right? And they're like, well, I work at so-and-so and I do much more hard work. How could they be making comparable money to me? And it's just like, you're mad at the wrong person. Be mad at your job for not seeing the value in what you do and lobby for a higher wage. And it's the same type of thing where we're for some reason, because we're so addicted to the name on the front of the jersey, that we sometimes get mad at the wrong people. I'm not gonna get mad at a player for trying to be where they want to be and make what they want to make, because their careers are shorter than almost any other career in the world, right?
Well, there's a lot of jealousy, I suppose, in terms of, I'm not the first person, I'll be the first person to admit that I can 100% understand and see why there's a lot of jealousy for people who think, oh, you just kick a ball around, and for the most part, not very well, some might say, and you're getting paid this much. When it's a double-edged sword and there's no winning from it. where you've got to think I have a lot of respect for players, which is why a lot of time they're idolized no matter what sport, because if anyone could do it, then you would have done it.
Right.
Given the choice, myself or yourself, would we have wished in another lifetime that we would have been able to be a pro player?
100%.
Hell, 100%. Hell yeah. And yes, there's a lot of envy, there's a lot of jealousy, but at the same time, it's not their fault. It is their fault they're so good at it. They may have some qualities which me or you may have lacked. They may have got lucky in certain regards, but at the same point, they worked their ass off to get there. And just by the sheer value of how many people there are who didn't make it, just by laws of averages, you're going to get that cone leading to a lot of money funneling to the top.
You really look at it too, Bailey. It's just like you in this age now where a lot of things are documented. You're starting to see the actual dedication that these players put themselves through. Like Kobe Bryant, who obviously passed away a few years ago, a great NBA player. You would see him stories about, I'm at the gym at 4 a.m. 3 hours before anyone else to work on my shot. You see him on the sideline; his knees are taped 100 times over with ice packs on them just to cool his joints, in between possessions. And that's a level of dedication that a lot of us would not probably have, to be honest.
We wouldn't want it. You ask a lot of people, would you want this life if you knew what it cost?
Yeah, you got the people who can't walk later in life because they played a year or two too long, and there is a lot of that doesn't go into it. We watch on game days, so all we think about is game day. For a lot of people, they'll tell you, well, the game day is the fun part. The real work is in the off season or during practices, training sessions, whatever. Like LeBron James every year spends over $1 million plus on conditioning his body. That's how he's been able to be as good as he has for as long as he has. And that there's a real commitment there that I think a lot of people neglect. And that's when they start calling athletes greedy. When, when you understand the economies of scale, you realize actually, no, it's not greedy at all.
Well, look at the risk factor more than anything else, as well as at the risk factor in terms of they, with nothing else but blind faith in their own ability, have put everything on the line day in, day out, night in, night out, to put in the hard hours training throughout school, throughout high school, throughout college, throughout the grassroots game in the UK and around Europe, with no promise. Nobody turned around to them and promised them and said, you do this, you're going to make it. Think of it just at the final hurdle. How many players do not make it in NFL and NBA and whatever sport at the final hurdle of getting drafted? More than make it. More than make it.
0.1% actually make it, right? I think
from the college game to the pro game.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it this way. We use the NFL as an example. The college football gives you 120 Division I teams. So that's at the highest level, 120. Each team has about 70 to 100 athletes on the team. In the NFL draft, about 100 people get selected in the NFL draft every year. And that's not even a guaranteeing that they have a roster spot. That's just a team is interested and maybe wants to keep you on. So the numbers are incredible. And if you boil that up to high school, it gets even more huge. So it's a lottery ticket. That's ultimately what it is.
Well, the longer that they've been in that system, playing their heart out to get there, the bigger of a risk it becomes, because you've lost your chance throughout college a lot of the time to study something where you could have done career. There's a massive emphasis, especially within the UK, within sports and football at the moment, where a lot of clubs are taking the action and saying, right, if you're going to be in our academy, we're going to put you through school, something that's not related to football, just in case you don't make it. Because there was a big case, I can't remember the name of the person at the moment now, but he was an academy player for years, and then at the age of 18, he didn't get signed and he was just dropped, and he ended up taking his own life.
I remember reading about that, yeah.
I can't remember the name of the player at the moment now, but it was a big thing at the time, and it still is now, where there's a massive incentive where if you don't make it, what's going to happen? No one hears about you. You're not famous. You're not successful within the sport. You've committed and given everything you've got. You've forgiven relationships. You've forgiven career. You've forgiven education. all in favor of this one goal, and then it didn't happen. And no one along that line said to you that you should have maybe taken up a trade or learnt something else along the way, which could have left you with a backup plan. But no, a lot of these players on the college game just go straight back home, and is that what you do? And especially players who tend to be the best at sports, the ones who used it as an escape when they were younger, have the worst homes to go back to in a lot of cases. And it's...
Yeah, and it's the part of sports that we don't think about. You know, we it's almost like where when you're looking back on a moment, a lot of times you think about the good and, you know, bury away the bad. You know, it's kind of like that, you know, where you see it. There's like a story of a guy who was a top flight high school athlete, and he went into college. He was expected to be an NFL player, and his career in college just didn't work out. He ended up transferring schools 5 times, and you know, and then graduated, and nobody in the league wanted him. You know, and the big thing with football too, especially, is if you don't make it to the NFL, you're very few options are available to you. At
Yeah,
least
you don't have
in
that lower
Europe,
leagues.
yeah, you have like a spring league here in the U.S. You have the Canadian League, and then you have a couple of indoor arena leagues, and that's it. Whereas if you were a football player in Europe, you know, let's say, you know, any one of the multiple leagues in Europe in England don't work out, there's a, you know, name a European country, they have a league, or probably multiple leagues, you know, that you know you could potentially play your craft at, and it's just something that in football you don't have in the U.S. But the biggest thing is to remember here is that we don't think about those failures. We just think about how lucky the people who made it are. I think we probably have to shift that viewpoint a little bit, to really understand, one, how difficult it is to get into that sort of a position, and two, to really acknowledge, you know, how how hard life becomes for those people who really went for it and just didn't make it. And I think if we did both of those things, we would probably have a better amount of empathy when it came to, you know, what an athlete goes through, you know, throughout their career.
Yeah, well, in the end of the day, they play for your club. They play for your club or a rival's club, and that's gonna overshadow everything else, regardless of what they may have been through or what's happened to them, whether you like them or not. Perfect example, you don't get so much in American sports because of the lack of national team sport, is that we've got in England, we've got cult heroes, players that we love because of what they've done for the country. If they come to your home ground wearing their club shirt, you don't give a shit who they are. They're just as bad as the next person who's there, no matter if they scored the winning goal in the World Cup final. Yes, you've got that respect for them, but during that 90 minutes, it's not going to be there. It's not going to work. So we kind of give them that. We always give people a load of shit regardless. I mean, yes, taking both sides into perspective would be the smart thing to do, but that's not what sport's an escape. You don't want to bring the politics into sport.
Right.
And that's something I see a lot more of, which you've written about as well, within politics, within especially the American game.
Yeah, there's a lot of I say the NFL is really guilty of this. The NBA, in its own way, is guilty of it too. But one thing that's always annoyed me, as an American watching sports, is, now maybe you could correct me on this. I'm pretty sure that if you're watching a Stoke match, that they're probably not playing the English national anthem before the game. But I don't know if that's a thing. Yeah, okay, I am correct there. I was making sure. In the U.S., you know, the national anthem is played before every game. There's this forced patriotism thing, which in and of itself has become a little bit of a political statement. And, you know, athletes have used their platforms to talk about causes that are important to them, you know, whether it could be something as benign as, you know, a fundraiser or a charity that they are passionate about, all the way up to something about like police brutality or racism in America. And it's just something where where there's a lot of this whole, a Fox News anchor once said about LeBron James to, quote, shut up and dribble when he started talking about politics. And it becomes a thing where a lot of people have kind of come out and said that they don't like it. They use sports as an escape. They don't want to have to hear about, whatever, if it's like the NBA is a 75% black league. They don't want to hear about African American issues. They want to just watch a basketball game. And my thing is, as we have pivoted into here in America, especially, there's more of an emphasis on being a fan of a player as opposed to a fan of a club. And so a lot of people that were like, well, I watch this team's games because my favorite player plays for this team. And so when you start doing that, you are a fan of the person. So you can't just at the same token say, well, I only care about them in the concept of how they play a game. It becomes the whole package. And I don't really have a problem with a player expressing their beliefs. If they've been given a platform, they're going to use their platform. I find that a lot of players use their platforms for good. A good example is when COVID hit and the NBA shut down. Something that people probably didn't think about is what happens to the people who work at the arenas, right? And right away, no owner did anything. They're like, well, shut down. We're not making money. We can't pay. Business. Sorry. And the player's like, oh, well, I know this janitor guy, and he's always been awesome to me here. And they paid their salary for a few months, right? And player didn't have to do that, but they were able to, they kind of saw that this was a real issue, and the way that people were being furloughed in America and everything like that was a real issue, and they did what they could do on their level to solve it. Players do things in the community all the time, a lot more than owners do. My opinion is we really should be taking owners to task and not doing enough, because you have this sprawling stadium in a downtown area, you're making all this money, and all of it, for some reason, you're not really trying to fortify the community around you. Some owners do a good job of it, but far more than not don't. And ultimately, it's just kind of a thing where we don't really have a lot of owners who express their politics, because more often than not, most people aren't going to like what they have to say, because if you talk to a super rich person, they're probably not going to want the same things that you or I want out of the political system, and whether that's economics or class warfare, whatever the case may be. And with players, they're in an interesting situation because they've made money. But a lot, you mentioned it earlier, a lot of them are coming from underprivileged backgrounds. So there's a dichotomy there where they remembered what that was like, and they want to usually make the world a better place if they possibly can. And that becomes the weird thing about American sports, is that it's a release, but then at the same time, there's like expectations of a player when he gets out of a bad community. That community expects him to give back. And it just and then voice an opinion on this, voice an opinion on that. And, recently O.J. Simpson passed away, who was obviously infamous, with the murder trial that he had in the mid-90s. And he was a guy who just wanted to be an athlete. He just wanted to be this guy. He didn't want to have any obligation to the civil rights movement as a black man in America. And he got killed for it, and he was criticized for it. And I think rightfully so, because ultimately when everybody's looking up to you, there is, I think, a little bit of a moral obligation there. And it's really about finding the balance in between, not saying too much. Like LeBron James does a good job of that. He tries not to go too far off, but he also lets his opinions be known.
Well, I feel like somewhere along the line, we went from a people, not just a nation to nation, we went from a people who looked at those who had standing and who had an audience, who came out and spoke their mind and spoke for what they believed in. We saw those as the heroes of the world. We saw those as the ones who put it all on the line and risked their fame and risked their opinion of themselves and their brand to say what they felt was right. And that was great, and that was always should be the case and what it should have remained as. But as I say, somewhere along the line that went from that side to now, if you don't see anything, then you are evil. If you refuse to stand up and say something which you, as a person, may feel like you are not qualified to speak on, But if you don't follow that general public narrative, then people are looking at you now and saying, you don't deserve that space. You don't deserve to be where you are. And it's horrible that you have this and you aren't spreading the good word. And a great example of that at the moment is we're seeing all I see over at TikTok at the moment, which is just absolute, to me, it infuriates me. It actually really infuriates me that there's a massive trend going around at the moment where people are posting they're posting today's block list of they're going around and sharing. So it's so ironic, but they are sharing on their TikTok lists of people who are famous, who they are now blocking because they have not spoken up about the Palestine situation. So because they have chosen not to speak up, they are now getting ridiculed and outrage is being thrown towards them, to the point where people are now blocking them because they feel like they should do. And that's the way I see it. And fair enough if you're a person who's in the public eye for being a public figure. But these are athletes. I know there's a lot of things, more things than not, that I know absolutely fuck all about. And if I was in that position, would I want to talk on those things and potentially get it wrong? Well, no. Especially with all this idea of people saying, oh, you're on the wrong side of history. Like, what do you mean you're on the wrong side of history? You're a part of history. Do you know a 100% surefire way not to be on the wrong side of history? Speak what you know and what you believe in.
Yeah, and I remember when the latest escalations happened in October, and I found it interesting. So, full disclosure, I'm half Palestinian. So, obviously, my opinion on this hits very close to home. I visited the region when I was a kid. Obviously, I lived in Jordan, which is a neighboring country. So, for your listeners, take whatever I say about this topic at face value, understanding that. But I remember when the October 7th stuff happened, and a lot of teams, a few players, but a lot of teams went on social and made their comments. And it was like always, the blanket, we condemn any type of terrorist attack and all that stuff, the stuff you're supposed to say. And I found it peculiar as a Palestinian, because there's been bloodshed in the region before. There's been bloodshed in the region a lot since then, with a lot of obviously the scales tipped on the Palestinian side, and those teams haven't said a peep. But I'm not going to be mad at a player who chooses not to speak on a topic that they aren't educated in. Ultimately, most players aren't educated in Middle Eastern affairs, and I'm not going to be mad at them for that, or a celebrity for that. I've blocked a few celebrities, I'll be honest, since then, but that's mostly been because if they are having rhetoric that is specifically pointed towards a devaluing of of a life in Palestine, right? But if somebody doesn't want to voice their opinion on the subject for whatever reason, whether they don't know enough about it, they don't feel comfortable speaking about it, we shouldn't be villainizing them for not voicing an opinion, platform or not, because what if they voice an opinion and it's not exactly what you want them to say? Then you're going to be villainizing them again, right? It's like, well, yeah, I wanted your opinion, but I didn't want it that way, and I think it's a microcosm of a problem that we have societally right now, which is everybody has their own bubble, right? And if you're not in tune with the bubble, it's a big problem, and you don't want to associate with those people, so you get further entrenched in the bubble. And we saw this a lot here in the U.S. after the 2016 election, where you would see people be like, "Oh, you voted for Donald Trump. I'm not going to be friends with you anymore." Or the opposite. Oh, you voted for Hillary Clinton, where I'm blocking you on social media, whatever. And it became these two siloed sections. And like I remember, like I talked to people who were on like dating apps, and they're like, "Oh, if you voted for this person, I don't want to even talk to you. Don't even bother." Right? And I always felt that was a little foolish, because an opposing perspective gives you a better look at the other side and can help you understand somebody from that other side. And I think nowadays we're so entrenched in our beliefs in whatever the case may be. It could be something as arbitrary over a topping on a pizza, but we're so entrenched in it, and we are validated by a small subset of online friends that agree with us, that anybody that has a differing opinion is automatically just, you are no good, get out of my zone type of thing. And some people call that prioritizing their sanity. I would call that just being closed minded. But for whether bringing it back to athletes speaking on any sort of political issue, I don't mind when they are asked questions about stuff that's going on that affects them at home. So if you play in a certain city and they're passing a legislation, and you're a resident of that city or state, your opinion probably matters because you're connected to it. If they're going to ask you about, anything that's going on in another country that you don't really have knowledge of, you don't have any heritage to. So, like, an exception was the NBA has one Israeli player. Um, his name is Denny Avdia. He plays for the Washington Wizards. He was asked about that stuff, which makes sense. He was born in Israel. Of course, he probably has an opinion. We don't have any Palestinian players in the NBA, so no one's being asked that, right? So I don't really have a problem with the athlete abstaining from that, or even the celebrity for that matter, abstaining from that. And I think that people who are trying to force opinions out of people, that's just kind of bad faith practice, in my opinion.
No, exactly. I mean, the way I kind of look at it now more than anything is where originally it was, oh, this is great. Everyone's unifying for a good cause. And the first real universal example of that across any sport in any nation was the taking a knee and the Black Lives Matter. And it was a great point. It was unifying the nation. It unified the world, and it works really well. It spread that around the world. But the problem with today's age, especially with social media and what's trending and what's not trending, is that people, for whatever reason, saw that the popularity they got from taking a stance on one side, and they got addicted to it. You get addicted to it, and to things that aren't really, things that aren't really any sensical. They don't work in any sense whatsoever for sports. Taking a knee, Black Lives Matter before the games, the celebration's great. It was amazing. It was incredible. But when you're coming up to athletes now and saying that they have to take a stance, otherwise it's then not a valued member of the community. But they're here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to play sport because that's what they want to do. There's no social responsibility. A lot of this comes from that mentality of, with great power comes great responsibility. And it's like, yes, that's true, but I feel like that's only on your own actions. The responsibility of your own actions and how far they go, where we saw this very, very much in the early days of social media, especially with athletes, where a lot of them got caught out and got quote unquote cancelled back when they had no idea what they were doing because social media was new to everybody. And so many people posted things that they might have been embarrassed by, or they didn't know that like a colleague would see or a worker would see, and they didn't realize the actual, because we're not used to being in communities with, for us, general followings go in the thousands, but for athletes, their followings are in the millions, and there's no way for them to physically conceive of that in their head. So they're going to make mistakes. So for me, where I look at it now is, if you're asking an athlete to make a point, which they don't, one, they may not necessarily care about, it's not in their domain. Two, they're not passionate about. And three, they're not educated about. You're asking them to make a point, you're effectively making them, you're telling them to make a mistake.
Mm.
And there's no benefit to athletes doing that whatsoever now.
No, yeah, it's again, the social media thing. Look, I've looked at my Facebook memories, over the years, and seeing the dumb shit I would post when I was 18, 19, right? And so think about an athlete kind of getting something that they posted when they were 15 gets brought up. It's like, and if it's especially egregious, I understand, but it's just like, oh, can you believe this person said this, that, or whatever? And I'm just like, we're putting way too much value into what they're saying here when they
because
were
of that,
just
though,
a kid.
Well, because of that, not just with athletes, but with everybody, we're a society that treads on eggshells.
Yes.
We tiptoe around everything so much that it's having the opposite effect, that we can't actually take anything seriously and make any real meaningful difference or change, because most of us are too afraid to say things, and rightfully so, because if they did say anything, this could be the end of their career. If it's not like you or I or some average Joe around the corner who can say something to a group of mates and they might be looked at a bit weird, like, oh, you can't really say that, it's not very woke. And there's a massive difference between that and then they're going to get forgiven the next day, versus an athlete who has no idea, who is now being morally forced into something that they don't want to do. Where if they make a mistake, and nope, it's very easy to, because no one really knows what is right and what's going to be wrong tomorrow, as opposed to today, then it's just going to backfire on them in their whole career. Especially, as you say, with young athletes, with things they may have done in college and videos that were caught in college of what they got up to, and now the franchise doesn't want to take them on anymore because of what it means for their own PR. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and you got the whole there's like the family value stuff, right? Like a lot of times you'll see a player like, oh, he has a a lewd relationship with this person or whatever, with a sex worker or something like that, and people are like, it's a pearl clutching moment where it's like, he's like, oh, I can't believe that a 21-year-old male would act like this. So it's like, you give that 21-year-old male a bunch of, obviously they're physically strong already, so and they're wealthy, so they're going to attract some certain people. Just like we got to kind of take a couple steps back sometimes when we're looking at this stuff, and I don't really. If you're not breaking laws, I'm kind of good with it, right? It's like I think a lot of times we get so locked in on, well, this athlete, has a lot of kids looking up to them. They need to be a good role model. At the same time, they're just still developing themselves. And I often say every 5 years or so, you're kind of become a different person. You evolve in a different way. Your life experiences shape you in one way or another. So to expect somebody who is 22, 23, 24 years old to be this peak role model 100% of the times is just unrealistic. They're human. They're young humans, and they're gonna make mistakes. Like I'm in my mid 30s now, and if I think about things I did in my mid 20s, I'd be like, what were you thinking? I'm just a different person now. It's totally different. And I think a lot of times some people discount that, like, well, he should have people advising him, and he should know better. And in this age of social media, it's so easy to make a mistake because you could just be lounging whatever one night, pick up your iPhone and send some tweet or post that is like, what the hell is he doing there? And then you have a PR backlash instantly. It's a
Mm.
it's a lot of there's a quote from Nikola Jokic, who's plays for the Denver Nuggets and a really good player, basketball player, and he's like, when I'm done playing this game, I really want to be obscure. I don't want anyone to know who I am. I really don't like fame, and I thought it was a really honest thing to say, and it kind of speaks to the toxicity of it, and anything wrong that you may or may not do. You always see these stories of like some athlete after they retire or something, like having some massive gambling debt or just doing this, that, or the other. And it's just like everybody's like, ooh, look at this garbage human being, and it's just like, yeah, I would probably want some anonymity as well. I often say if you're going to be a professional athlete, the best way to be is to be just like an average reserve player. No one knows who you are. No one cares. If you do anything on the court, it's a blessing, and then you retire and no one really is too aware. You made a decent amount of money, whereas like I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary about Michael Jordan called The Last Dance, but it's a
Love it.
10-part.
Loved it.
Yeah, it's a great documentary. But there's like a part where he was like explaining what he had to do, like to go from city to city when he was playing games. Like he
When he
had
was
no
in the
life.
hotel rooms and he was just
Yeah,
sitting there
he
in
just
hotel
scooped
rooms on his
up.
own.
Yeah, and
Couldn't
it's
go
because
anywhere.
he's Michael Jordan. Everywhere he goes, he's going to have autograph demands and such and things like that. And when you're a star player, that's what happens. And and even after you retire, they still remember. So it's interesting existence, I guess. And of course, there's they get paid a lot of money and things, but there's the mental strain there that a lot of people don't talk about. And that being asked to comment on stuff is all part of the deal, all part of the stressors of being a professional athlete.
Well, it's in the contract now in professional athletes, especially in the US, where you have to make X amount of media appearances when you're required to. And it's coming over into football in Europe and around the UK as well. But it's interesting what you just said, though, because I heard a quote a while ago which resonates with myself more and more now, which is, for anybody who wants to be successful, focus first on becoming rich and then decide whether or not you still want to be famous.
Yeah, it's I don't know how much of a hip hop listener you are, but as the Notorious B.I.G. once said, "Mo money, mo problems," right? But so
We'll bring it back to athletes, so like you just said, I mean, there's certain players who just have it exactly like you just said. Being one of the reserves players is probably one of the best you'll get, because for a person like you or I, just being around that environment, being around the training ground each day with these amazing players and the whole club and the whole squad, it's incredible. Like a player that comes to mind from, a position that comes to mind is like being the backup kicker in an NFL team. Like you could do really. I always thought I could make it. As I played a lot of football in my life, and I've got quite a powerful kick. I always thought so many times that there's got to be loads of footballers who couldn't make it pro as a footballer, go over and try and be a kicker in the NFL, because you're going to have so much more kicking experience. Obviously, it's slightly different. Saying that is, again, you get the money, you get the environment, you get the lifestyle. You haven't got to be in tip-top physical condition like the rest of them, but you're going to make a hell of a lot, and you're going to be in those dressing rooms. You're going to hear it all. You're going to see it all. And as a passionate player and a passionate fan, you're going to love that. There's a player which gets a lot of stick and a lot of jokes for Man City, called Scott Carson. He's an older player. He's a goalkeeper. I think he's like 38, 39, 40, something like that, early 40s maybe. And he's a third choice goalkeeper for Man City. He knows he's never going to kick a ball, ever. He knows that, and he doesn't give a shit at all if he's never going to kick a ball, because I don't know if you've seen it on Netflix, but there's a great documentary called Man City Treble Winners. So last year when they won the treble, it's just come out recently. And it just documents the whole time throughout the Premier League, throughout the Champions League, throughout the FA Cup, each game going around. And then Scott Carson's there, and he gets a medal for every single one of them because he's played like 5 minutes at the end and whatnot. And he's just him going around the changing rooms, being there as a character. Absolutely loves it. And I couldn't think of anything better to be.
It's a dream job, right? If you're into it, you're right there. Like say you're on the training ground, you're in these great facilities, and especially Manchester City, they have great, amazing facilities. Everything about them is first class. And yeah, you don't have the pressure from the papers and the reporters and stuff. You're the third choice goalkeeper. It's like no one cares what you do. And you would have to mess up real bad to really get any sort of publicity. And you're still playing the game you love in a certain capacity. And it's a great existence to have. And the thing is, those guys, there brings me to a quote. And I've been mentioning a lot of basketball stuff, so it's NBA playoff season, so it's on my mind, I think. But where a guy who used to play for the Boston Celtics, his name is Brian Scalabrine. He's a commentator now, and he had this line one time where he said, "I'm closer to being Michael Jordan or LeBron James than you are of being me." And he would go and prove it. He would go to like a local gym and just be taking shots or whatever. And people like, "Oh, hey, that's Brian Scalabrine. He played here. Want to go play one-on-one?" And he'd be like, "Yeah, sure. You want to go? Go ahead." And he'll just be toying with them, and then he just gets bored and then ends up beating them 11-0 because he worked his whole life to be an NBA player. And so even if you're a reserve, the talent level is just so massive And that's just like, so you could have those moments like that. You could probably make a nice little TikTok career off of just, wrecking people in pickup games, and like imagine if you were a second or third string midfielder in football, like, you
Well,
just go and start just giving people work.
a great example of that is how, I don't know if you've played FIFA before,
Of course.
video game, EA Sports.
Yeah.
A great example is that everyone always thinks that these certain players, and this would probably relate to any NFL player or NBA player, or whatever it might be. Everyone thinks, oh, certain players are really fast, certain players are really slow, because they're given a number and they say, okay, this person's fast. And then if you watch them on a pitch with other professional athletes, they look pretty damn pretty slow compared to the ultra fast, like could be Olympic level sprinters if they wanted to be track and field. But if I can guarantee you pick the slowest player on the team and put them up against the average man at that age and that demographic, and just tell them to do get them to do a 50-yard dash against each other, they're going to be nowhere near whatsoever. Not by a long shot. These are professional athletes who are just at the top of their game, not just in terms of the physical element of things, but the tactical element of things. Because I'm a big tactics buff when it comes to football, especially. I imagine yourself as a journalist. I've seen some of your stuff. I've read through some of your stuff tactics-wise. It's way over my head when it comes to other sports. But that diving deep into it, and is one thing, again, being able to be that athletically gifted and talented. Yes, they've worked hard for it, but it's one thing to be that, but it's another thing to have the brain for it as well. So as a journalist now, because here's my argument for journalists, and where I kind of see it kind of going off path. I wanted to get your opinion on it.
Sure.
How much of sports journalism now is based purely on opinion and clickbaity titles and views and numbers versus an actual in-depth knowledge of the game?
I think clickbait is a really big problem. I think most articles you come across now are clickbaity. And like I had interviewed a while back for a publication to cover the NFL for them. And right after the interview, I looked through their website, which admittedly, dumb move by me. Should have done it before the interview. But yeah, everything was like, I'll give you an example. Like we just talked about a third string goalkeeper, right? Let's say hypothetically he signed with Aston Villa. Okay, this publication, the way they would headline it, wouldn't be XYZ player signs with Aston Villa. It would be, oh, surprising Manchester City move to Aston Villa, right? And then you would think, oh, that could be anybody. It could be one of the, there's a million great players on Manchester City. And you open it and it's like, oh, it's third string goalkeeper. Awesome. I wasted my time opening this article. And that's prevalent because in the modern economy of producing content online, click generation for blogs and stuff like that is higher than it's ever been. You have the other gorilla in the room, which is the advent of AI when it comes to writing. That's I write on Medium. Obviously, that's where you found all my stuff. Medium, I think, does a good job of filtering out AI generated content. That's like a big stance that they've had, but they are not one of the many that does that. You've seen entire news desks get shuttered because they're going to move over to AI. But, ultimately, you're trying to get people to click on the page. And I think as a journalist, you always want to find the balance of being genuine while also enticing people to open your links, because if you scroll down the news feed, which is how most people see their stuff, it's going to be the title, maybe like a subheading that kind of is supposed to tell you what the article is briefly. And a lot of people they will get a click by any means necessary, and they've in many ways become content mills, right? Where they want.
I've seen it with we have Sport Bible in the UK, like exactly what you've just said, and it absolutely infuriates me that much that I don't click on the link. I'd rather go through the comments to find out what the actual topic or the player is in question first. We'll say again, like you say, surprising, shock player makes a surprising move to this team, you don't want to click on the link because you're going to scroll through it. You have to go to the comments and it's like, it's just this person, like you just said. But I heard a great bit of advice for any kind of clickbaity stuff beforehand, being as long as you have a good package and a good offering, you can wrap it up in whatever gift wrapping paper you want. How do you strike that balance as a journalist as a sports journalist in particular, in today's industry?
I always strive for, because here's the way I look at it too. A lot of people make sports content, especially here in the US. And my goal is always to have a conversation that some people maybe aren't having. Everybody does game reactions, everybody does game predictions, and just a lot of like, oh, this player's signing here, let's analyze what that means, and so on and so forth. I always find the better stuff is stuff that's a little bit more well thought out. So my balance is always going to be a nuanced opinion on something that is actually relevant today, right? And you might be looking at it where everybody's writing this article about this is happening. What are they going to be saying? How are they going to be looking at it? What's the angle I can take to stand out from the crowd, right? Because that's ultimately what you're doing. Because if you're following one of the more popular sports here in America, you're going to be talking about something that everybody's talking about. Like if the Super Bowl is happening and the Kansas City Chiefs are in it, everybody's going to be writing about the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl, and you have to look at it as like, all right, well, what's the part that I want to focus on that I think is interesting and a story worth telling? And how do I present that in a way that people are going to want to read it? For me, the hardest part of writing, to be honest with you, Bailey, is title generation, because I know how to structure my articles, and I think I do a pretty decent job of writing.
You do. They're very good. They're very good.
Appreciate you. But getting a title that makes somebody want to click on it is the hardest part. And sometimes there's misses. You kind of whiff on them sometimes, but that's the hard thing, because it's an overabundance of choice, right, these days. And so I always think that the big priority is, if you write the good stuff and you write genuine good content, people are going to flock to you eventually, and that kind of speaks to your gift wrap point there. And yeah, so I just always try to say I just don't want to do what everybody else is doing, right? And that's kind of the way I kind of approach it. And because again, especially in sports, it's just like a game happens. Okay, how are people going to cover this? Like, well, this means this for this person's legacy, and this means this series has done this. All of these like superlative, big type of sweeping generalizations. And I think there's been an increased appetite lately, here in America at least, not to have these just like overly opinionated talking head type content generation, where there's a little bit more of an interest on the tactical side. There's a little bit more of an interest on a deeper conversation that we might not have had, over the past few years. And so I think eventually people are going to choose good content. It's just a matter of finding the topics that you are passionate about writing about. And like here we have guys like Stephen A. Smith, and he's on ESPN. He's everywhere, and he is a commentator that a lot of times is just, for lack of a better term, talking out of his ass. And like he won't watch a game. He'll just say crazy stuff just to get headlines. And I think those people are always going to be there. But
I know a few of those.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure in the UK scene, especially like the
it's comical though. It is entertainment, especially when you see the likes of in the UK. We have the likes of, say, Gary Neville or Roy Keane, where it's comedy at some points. Where it used to be when I was growing up watching, say, Monday Night Football, the game. I don't know if you had the same for the commentary, like post game commentary and punditry, where during the game, after the game and during the intervals and periods in the game, there used to be so much tactical analysis, where they'd go on and they'd talk and have conversations and debates about it for about an hour after the game had finished, where now, more often than not, they speak very quickly about the highlights for 20 minutes, and then they just try and cut to as many ad breaks whilst you haven't turned over as possible.
what we
But
have
then,
here, Bailey, is like we have it here for the NBA. We also have it for Champions League with the coverage here at Paramount Plus, where it's just like it's almost a comedy show. And it's just like it's designed to to get clipped on Instagram and get a bunch of reactions like, "Oh, I can't believe Thierry Henry said that. I can't believe Shaquille
mm,
O'Neal said that. Whatever, and here for in case you didn't know, our Champions League commentary has I think it's Thierry Henry, I think Del Piero does some, and Micah Richards as well. So
yeah, it's the
that's
same as in the UK one for, well, it's partly in the UK. Depends on
mhm.
what network it's on. I mean, yeah, like you say, it's exactly that though. It's getting those highlights for those viral reels is so become such an industry where it's taking away from the actual long form, in depth content, and that's one of the things I'm a podcaster. You're a podcaster. It's one thing I hate about a lot of podcasts now, especially smaller podcasts, is that you get excited and enticed by when you see these reels or these TikToks or the clips from the podcast, and that's great. But then you actually listen to the podcast, and they're almost trying to catch people out. They're almost trying to ask them the questions, which is going to get a response. And especially depending on what's trending, obviously you yourself hearing about people, especially the Palestine situation at the moment, people just ask them because you know it's going to get a response, it's going to get viewers, but you lose so much of the actual value of in-depth content when you go for that, which is why I'm at the moment falling in love with Medium articles in particular, especially with writers like yourself, because it's not click. Yes, you might have a clickbaity title, but when you're reading these things and you get an idea of the person behind it, and you can understand where they're coming from, and you get a general idea of what points they try and push and what they agree with and what they disagree with, you start to then feel reconnected with the content creator at the same time. And within journalism, especially, where for me, I've always loved sports journalism because of the sports is completely subjective. Regardless of what you think, it's subjective. Within public arenas, where it's general public knowledge or things that are trending at the moment or whatever is the hot topic, it doesn't really feel like opinion anymore. Where it's this or it's that, it's this or it's that. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, you're right. Blah 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 blah. Sport has always been subjective, and I prefer listening to people's opinions, even if I know they're wrong. I like their opinion because of where it's come from.
Yeah, and I think what makes sports journalism in particular so fascinating is that you could get a myriad of different type of voices, and what I see, what you see, what somebody else sees is always going to be different, from a different lens of our just different viewpoints. And like I look at there's different type of commentators that kind of look at like, well, they were running this set play here and this is why this happened there, and another person might focus on a player's conditioning as to why this happened. Well, this is why they broke down at this point in time because their conditioning is what it needs to be, type thing. And both points are valid. Both points will bring up different points and different just kind of it's like a math problem, where it's more than one solution. And I think that's what makes it so good. And whereas, like, is what annoys me about political commentary because it's a lot of sweeping generalization. It's a lot of, well, you're an idiot if you don't feel this way, and how could you even think of it this way, sort of thing. And with sports, it's kind of it's a little bit open to interpretation, generally speaking. And I think sports journalism is a increasingly popular field for a lot of people. We are seeing a shift into a lot of people who cover teams that they're a fan of, and it's like the rise of fan generated content, which I find really interesting. um, I think if you're a fan of a team, you probably would like to hear content from another fan as opposed to a quote unquote national platform just continuing to just say maybe say things that they aren't super connected, so they don't understand about your team or your club. And so that's kind of an interesting evolution. Myself, I'm a little bit more of the general side, but I have nothing but respect for people who can objectively put out content about teams that they're a fan of. I know I couldn't do it. That's why I very rarely write about teams that I'm a fan of.
Well, that's the thing. If you are a fan of these things, it doesn't have to be objective anymore. I mean,
True.
I love the idea of you get so many, like, with your favorite commentators or pundits, you know who they support. And you know if they're talking about them, it's going to be a little bit swayed in favor of them and it's going to be biased. And you're okay with that because you know that. You can turn around. Like, one thing I've always wondered is what would happen, what would the commentary sound like if England win the World Cup? Because commentators and pundits, they have to try their best to be neutral whenever they can. But what would happen if they won the World Cup? You ask me, as if I was to be a pundit in that game, and you're on the edge of your seat.
Mm.
If we lose the game, I'm going to break down in tears, and I'm not going to be able to continue talking. If we win the game, I'm going to break down in tears, and I'm not going to be able to continue talking. It's like, do you feel like for you in particular, you say you sway towards the objective side of things as opposed to subjective?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that's the way that, again, people are trying to be with how modern journalism is, without trying your best not to pick sides?
No, I think it's the opposite. I think a lot of people are kind of more on the subjective side because they, as much as people, I think even if you try to be objective, you end up being subjective, whether you like it or not, because there is no absolute, there is no true objectivity with stuff, because when you watch a game, it doesn't matter what the sport is, you kind of gravitate towards a player or a team naturally. You may not like a play style, so you go the other way, or you may have heard about a player before and you like something about them, or whatever the case may be, or you didn't like the way a player dove for a foul, so you're like, oh, I hate that guy, I want him to lose, right? True objectivity is tough, right? And that's where that's kind of the beauty of it, because I think there is a situation now where you have people that are way too close to the situation creating content. And I think that there's an audience for that stuff. It's not something I in good conscience want to create, because I like to at least have a presentation of both sides of an argument. But if you are a Manchester United fan and you just played against Arsenal and lost, and you thought that there should have been a penalty that went to VAR or whatever, and you're making content, you're just going to be going on and on and on about how United got jobbed or whatever, and so on and so forth. Refs this, VAR that, it's the same talking point. So it just becomes a thing where I was like, oh, that's like just not enjoyable for me, right? But I understand why you would want to create it if you're a fan of that. So I always feel like there should be at least a goal of being somewhat fair, but at the end of the day, we all have our biases that creep up, even if we don't think they're there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, especially in sports. I mean, a lot of people are nowadays in particular try to be as unbiased as they can. We all fail at every hurdle along the way at that, but we always like to come across as if we are unbiased in our opinions, because that's how we feel. We feel that we are in the center and we are unbiased because our way is the way. It's how we all feel. Sports, for me, sports the only place where I can turn around and say, no, fuck that. Fuck that, you're shit. Like that's the only arena I can publicly say that now and not get harassed for my opinion. And it's like, if you take that out of sports, what do you have? Because sport, at the end of the day, those players are warriors, of competitive warriors who've got that much, well, in most cases, got that much testosterone rushing through their body, and they put their whole life on the line for the sport. Like that, it comes out, it's animalistic to an extent. And if you take that away from me, if you take that away from the sport, you're going to lose a lot of people. And that's why it sells so much. Like you say, that subjective side sells so much, because in a world where we are surrounded by people trying not to step on eggshells and be politically correct all the time, you can go to a game and you can say whatever you want within reason, obviously.
Yeah.
And you can enjoy yourself, vent as much as you want, let off some steam. Again, like you said, we spoke about earlier in the podcast, when the time in your life when the Knicks was your getaway and your escape.
Yeah.
It's where we're allowed to, for the most part, we're allowed to be men. We're allowed to be men in those environments, surrounded by other men and women who are in that same zone as you are. The blinkers on. The only thing that matters is the game and that result for that time and that time only.
Yeah, and I couldn't have said that better, to be honest. And it is a very good point that it's the last true thing where you could really just kind of let loose and not be judged about it. Obviously, like you said, within reason. Like, you don't want to be assaulting people in the stands or whatever. That's not something that should be something that you resort to. But nothing wrong with getting into an opposing fan's face. Nothing wrong with as long as it doesn't turn excessively vient.
I don't know. I
And
used to love that. I love that South Park sketch with Randy at his Stan's
yeah,
baseball games.
just mixing it up, right? It's just like it's you like you say, you get to let loose, get to there because there's tribalism, there's animalism, there's my team versus your team. There's this whole thing that is just inherently within us that just comes out when we're watching our favorite teams play because we just have that level of connection with them, however
It's
that was
family.
forged. And yeah, that's another thing too. Like that's the beauty of it. How one person came to a team could be a lot different than how another person came to a team. It could be a thing where somebody's like, "Oh, my entire family lived in this area, and we've always been a fan of this team." And another person would be like, "Hey, I moved here, I adopted this team, and I'm just as passionate as you are." And that's the beauty of it because it allows for connection. With people regardless of your background. You could be a super rich person next to a person who's struggling to survive, but you're both connected into sharing for this team and hoping for the result and yelling when things don't go your way and cheering madly when they do. And there's something beautiful about that, right? It's not something in our world today. There's a lot of bad things, right? There's a lot of things that just are just shitty, and miserable. And whenever you have the thing that's going to bring you some level of happiness or evoke some sort of emotion out of you, I think that the existence of that thing is a good thing. And so yeah, so I just feel like that's why I write about sports, because it's just the understanding of that. And if anything I write allows somebody to kind of say, oh yeah, that's a really good point, or actually counterpoint, this is what I think, and then we have a discussion, that's always a good thing.
Well, that was the core of sports, and that's how it started, and that's how it became what it is today. But I've always seen, especially nowadays, how sports changed in my lifetime, where it used to be, again, people used to say, oh, it's a men's game, and now it's nothing, and it's obviously a lot of time it's protecting clubs protecting their investment because there's that much money in it. It's a lot. They try and take the animalistic side out of things. So what we've just spoke about is the core of sport, and it's what keeps it together at its center. What are some of the things, in your opinion, from what you've seen, which are taking away from sport at the moment, on the whole? What some things? Because I know you've written about obviously gambling coming in on quite a lot in America, which you've had over in Europe since the beginning of time. Gambling within sports, and it's never really been too much of an issue. But there's certain things that are kind of taking away from. When I say our game, I mean sport itself.
Yeah, so lately you've had a few players here in the U.S. on the gambling side get in trouble for gambling on games because it's so accessible via mobile apps and stuff like that. A lot of people here, they have a problem with the fact that you'll be watching a game and in the middle of the game they would have an ad break about a wager you could place in the middle of the match. Obviously, every single sports league is now sponsored by a different sports book. So a lot of people think that takes away from it. I think ultimately, like, you're not going to get rid of the gambling thing. It's once you open that door, you can't close it, right?
Well, I mean,
Beyond that,
people are trying to, though. I mean, we've had one of the bigger things that's happening recently, which affects my club Stoke massively, is that so one thing they used to do beforehand is that they took away alcohol sponsors for clubs. About a decade or two back. They took took away alcohol sponsors for clubs because it's not something they want to promote, especially with so many kids watching. And now they've introduced a rule in the Premier League where they're doing the same thing with gambling. So gambling companies, and a lot of gambling companies own clubs for the sake of their sponsorships and whatnot that they bring. They don't allow it anymore. They've taken it away, so they can no longer name stadiums or have the gambling sponsor on their shirts. So you can own the club, you can have your affiliations, you can do it locally, but if it's on TV or to be shown to the wider media, then it's not allowed anymore. That's one thing we've had, and for me that affects my team massively because I don't know if you've heard of Bet365.
I was just about to bring them up. So yeah, I've heard Bet365.
Bet365, so I used to work for them. They were made in Stoke-on-Trent. They own Stoke City, and it's the biggest online gambling company in the world. And they're stupidly wealthy, and it's from working there firsthand, speaking to people who've got gambling issues. As you say, once you've opened that can of worms, you're never going back again.
Yeah, and that's like the thing we're kind of grappling with here in the US is how much of it's going to be integrated, how much of it is going to be a part of things. And, a lot of people seem to have a problem with leagues themselves, kind of saying, oh, we're hard on gambling, but actually here's this new segment sponsored by FanDuel Sportsbook or whatever. And, so there's a balance there that they're trying to strike. A NBA player recently was banned for life because he was betting on himself during games. Where
I read it in one of your articles.
Yeah, the Jonte Porter situation, and so that's kind of like where people feel like maybe integrity is being lost there. Another thing I feel, this is just a personal thing of mine, is it might be as old as time, and I'm sure they did this back in the 70s and 80s, but of course I wasn't around for that, is officiating in sports is always a hot topic of conversation. I really feel like what we've been subject to, and I know we have this in European football all the time, we're like with VAR decisions and stuff like that.
God.
Where we focus, we focus a little bit, I think, too much on officiating, and it becomes a very easy scapegoat. My viewpoint a lot of times is, unless it's like a do or die play, like last second of a game, and it's a bad call, generally officiating is a roadblock of the game, right? It's part of it. Athletes are going to make mistakes; they're human. Officials are going to miss calls; they are human as well. And I think it's easier to say, "Well, the official screwed my team over," as opposed to, "Well, my team didn't make enough plays down the stretch." And I feel like that focus on officiating, while it does need to improve, no one disagrees with that. There, I think, is a little bit too much of a focus on it, and where it becomes a thing where, oh, my team lost, they must have been getting bad calls, or they must have had been jobbed by the refs, or whatever the case may be. I just feel it takes
I
away
used
from
to
the
be a
conversation.
referee. I used to be a referee. Yeah, I was a referee for years. So how it went by was, as a job as a young kid, you could referee kids' games, and you'd get a good amount for your age in terms of how much you'd be earning per hour. And I did that for a while, went up to adult level as well. And one thing I can say categorically is that obviously I'm not refereeing top games where you can be paid to make certain mistakes or errors. Not a single referee has ever done that on purpose, because at that speed, it's nigh on impossible to make a split-second decision which is premeditated. You don't know what's going to happen. The only way you can, as a referee, make these decisions is maybe you could say the number of cards, for example, because you can control that over and under and whatnot, and blah, blah, blah. But in terms of split-second decisions, game-changing decisions, the offside call, the foul, the penalty call, which you can make those decisions beforehand. No matter how much someone's going to pay you to make this decision, you can't do it. And yes, there's a lot of people who say blame the referees, and that's always a part of it, because as a scapegoat, as being a referee, I'd say, I'd even turn around to players a lot of the time and say, I will happily be the scapegoat so you guys don't kill each other. If you don't take it out on me, somebody you're not allowed to hit, you're going to end up taking it out on each other and on the fans on each other as well. And have that scapegoat, have that person who's going to take it all on the chin. That's fine. But the one thing I wish would come from all referees in all sports, because we have it within rugby in the UK, is the referees are mic'd up. They've got a mic. They've got a mic, and everyone in the audience can hear what's going on. They can hear what they're saying. Whatever reason, in football, they refuse to do it. And do they do it in American sports as well? Do they have the mic?
No, they do not.
Again, that's one surefire way right there. You can turn around and say, regardless of what, it just makes them more human. It makes referees more human. And it's going to take away from that abuse that they get, because I got some abuse. Fair enough, I wasn't very good. But they get some abuse.
Yeah, and so that's another thing. And the last thing I would say is, we have this a lot here. I'm not sure if it's a situation in Europe as well, but a lot of times nobody can do anything without somebody saying, well, okay, but are they better than this person who came before them? The whole legacy debate. We see it a lot with LeBron James here. It's like, oh, is he better than Michael Jordan now, or whatever? It's like we end up diluting what we're seeing because we have this need to compare. And I know, like in football, you had the Messi Ronaldo debates ad nauseum, year after year after year, and I just feel like it takes away from what's happening in the moment. And so I think fans are falling victim to that, and as a result, people who make content and stuff, they are dialing in on that because, like, oh, it's what fans want, right? So it's kind of like a never-ending cycle, so to speak. And I think if we took away some of that, because you have to have a little bit of it, you can't just completely take away the comparisons because people are just going to want to do that. You should have some capability to focus on what I just witnessed was awesome, and this is why it was awesome, right? and then as opposed to saying like, oh, hey, Kylian Mbappe had this great game, blah blah blah. It's like, yeah, but Messi did this, and I'm just like, it doesn't matter. Like that shouldn't take away from what this other guy did, And I think that's something that fans and writers, video makers, podcasters, we could all do better about when it comes to covering sports.
100%. I mean, I love your arguments that you made when comparing players of different generations and how good they are and how important they are to their own franchises. The idea of looking at it through a percentage lens, that I really enjoyed looking at, because I instantly was trying to apply that to how that would work within football. Doesn't quite carry over as much because obviously, like we spoke about earlier, we don't have those strict budgets for every team. But to see as how important a player is and how much they earn, like you said, Michael Jordan earned how much was it? And that was how much percentage compared to Kobe?
Yeah, so a lot of times it would be like 25, 23%, Kobe closer to 30%, if I recall. And I think the thing is, like, numbers when it comes to salaries of players is you get just blitzed by the number, right? You're like, oh my God, this guy makes $45 million a year. That's a lot of money, right? And you're like, well, I remember when this guy only made $20 million a year. But if you really peel back the layer and you think, well, okay, hold on. Well, how much was the team salary cap then? And if the percentages are similar, and you can't, then you just have to hold the players to the same standard of what percent they were making. So if a guy in 1995 who was only making like 10 million was making 20% of the team's cap, and then a player today who's making 35 million is also only making 20% of the cap, the expectations for both of those players should be the same. As opposed to saying, well, you're making 40 billion and the guy who I used to watch when I was growing up only made 10, so you should be 4 times better. That just doesn't make any sense because it's economies of scale, it's inflation, it's whatever. It's just the modern realities of financials in sports today. And I think that's a gap for a lot of people.
No, it definitely is. And like we touched on the financials earlier, not to go back into it again, but it's such a stupid argument that a player's relative ability is based on and or their value is based on the financials, because it's clearly not. Like, especially it's a franchise, as you say, it's a franchise. It's in the name. It's not about the sport. It's not about how good they are. It's their brand value. We look at, so one of the big things that Man United got wrong massively previously since the Alex Ferguson era is that they signed players who had bigger names for a lot of money, who, all intents and purposes, were shit, and they were getting large salaries. I mean, we don't look at football numbers in terms of how much they earn per year, but we look at how much they earn per week, and they were getting very large amounts for effectively just the name because of the shirt sales, and then that would correlate to saying he's terrible because of we used to have this player and so on and so forth. But then you can have a player like a big example, I'd say, going back to the Man City as well, was at the time, I didn't understand it, but he has gone and proven his worth now. Jack Grealish, if you know who he is. Yeah. Jack Grealish at the time was sold to Man City for around £100 million. And that's a lot of money for a player who nobody thought was worth that much. But at the time, he was the hottest prospect in terms of brand deals and shirts and in the whole of England. The whole of England loved him. They loved his personality. They loved his character. They loved his look. He was getting modelling contracts and brand deals left, right and centre, and everyone absolutely loved. And with complete truthfulness as well, like, he's fucking ace. He's an awesome person to listen to. He's a funny guy. He's just a lad from Birmingham who gets on and has a laugh, and everyone loves him for good reason. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve it at all. But the deal that he got because of that with this team does not warrant how good of a player he is. Which I imagine is something you do also get within, especially the American market, because I'm just imagining jersey sales. Like when what's the name, went to the New England Patriots?
Tom Brady?
Yeah, of course. It shows my knowledge. It's just on the top of my head. I couldn't think of it. When he went to the New England Patriots and the team that they were, and the jersey sales alone would cover his contract and then some. Yes, he's obviously a poor example because he's one of the best players to have ever lived. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he's aging a hell of a lot.
Yeah, and I feel like the jersey sales here aren't really advertised as such a big deal as they are in Europe. And like the NBA obviously is going to market players that are going to be able to move the needle in that way. And different players do it in different ways. NFL is the same way. NFL, the general rule is the quarterback's always going to sell the most jerseys. That's just, that's the person who's touching the ball every single play. It's the most important player of every franchise. And they're going to sell crazy amounts of sales in jerseys and merchandise and whatever the case may be. And, it's there is a marketability aspect, and that does help when considering a player's like trade value and such. And obviously in football in Europe, the transfer market, totally different thing than what they have here. There's no transfer fee, right? It's just, either you sign as a free agent, your old club gets nothing, or you do a trade for assets, what they say, so other players or draft picks or cash considerations, whatever the case may be. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic there. But a team will always go for a player who they think they can market in some way or another, right? It's part of the calculus. Oh, you could sell a lot of jerseys for us. Awesome. That means you could do a lot of events here. You could do a lot of different things in the community here to make us look good, and it's all part of it, right? The financial element of sports is still, it's something that a lot of people, I think, maybe still aren't even comfortable talking about. But it's incredibly important when, at the end of the day, these clubs, they are businesses, right? So they're going to make investments, and they're going to try and do things and try to get their most return on investment as possible. And the player is going to try to maximize their earning potential, so they have to be marketable as well. So it's a kind of a balancing act there.
Awesome. And then just lastly, because I'm quite wary of the time for yourself, we've been quite late over there.
Yeah.
Take me through, give me a rundown to a complete novice of the situation in the playoffs at the moment? Because I know that's what's on your mind at the moment, what you care about the most right now. Run me through it.
Yeah, so in the NBA, obviously we have the top 8 teams from each conference have a playoff series. It starts with
I know
16 teams.
I know how the playoffs work. I
Okay,
mean
okay.
the
Oh,
playoffs
sorry, my
as they
bad.
are.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry,
So
that's on me.
in the Eastern Conference, it feels like Boston is the team to beat because they've been so good all year. I worry about them a little bit because they rely so much on the 3-point shot, and when the shots aren't falling, they don't have a backup plan, you know. And they're playing Cleveland right now. They beat Cleveland handily today. They're up 2-1 in the series. I would imagine they beat them in 5 games. On the other side in the East, you have the Knicks and the Pacers, which is a bloodbath. Every game is close. Every game is a heart attack.
Go Knicks.
Of course, I'm a Knicks fan. So of course I want the Knicks to win. Knicks are
I guess I'm an
ravaged by
honorary
injuries.
Knicks fan now.
Yeah, there you go. I appreciate that. Yeah, they're ravaged by injury. They're missing 4 or 5 key players, which on a basketball team is devastating. And the Pacers are very young and an exciting team, so it's been a good series. I still think the Knicks probably find a way.
Where did the Knicks
But I
finish
think,
in the open season?
yeah, so they ended up as a second seed in the conference. So they won 50 games out of the 82, so they had a really good season. But as the playoffs reared, the injuries started to mount up. So they are struggling for dealing with that right now.
Like 80
I think
games in a season is
it's a lot. I
oh
know it's a lot. It's
Jesus.
a lot. It's a lot. Yeah, I think football has it right, man. About
Whoa.
38 to 45 games.
I don't
Like,
know. I don't know.
you
So
think?
so at the moment FIFA is currently, it only came out in the news the other day. FIFA is currently being sued by World Football Associations because of the amount of games that they're trying to get players to play internationally in the off season.
Oh.
Because that's affecting the domestic leagues, and the domestic leagues are what bring in so much money for the local communities.
Mm-hmm.
So we're playing a lot, but at the same time, I'd argue that you look at the mileage covered in a football match, as opposed to a basketball game.
Yeah.
Probably quite a lot more, and it's an impact. Well, basketball technically is a non-contact sport. Technically,
Right. Yeah.
Doesn't always go down that way, but it is. And then football, it's becoming more and more non-contact, but the fine margins are that those hairline fractures, the knee injuries at the moment, and it's just an absolute bloodbath for most players. And you'd be lucky to get through a whole season without an injury. Any player would be lucky to get through a whole season without an injury. And I imagine basketball on the hard floors as well, knees are an absolute
Knees,
killer.
ankles, hamstrings. Obviously, a lot of stop and start, stop and start, stop and start. And that's a consideration for the NBA as well. The issue with the NBA is they're never going to reduce the number of games because the players would never agree to it because it would mean smaller salaries. And because they'd have to bargain and all that. That's the real issue, is because you talk about game checks, because that's how their salaries are broken up. So if you take less game checks, that's less ticket revenue to distribute. But back to the playoff bit. Yeah, I think the Knicks still can get by the Pacers. The Pacers are so young, very inexperienced. But ultimately, I think Boston represents the Eastern Conference in the finals. They're just really good. They're all mostly healthy right now. The West, I think, is far more interesting because you have Denver, who won last year, so the incumbent, but you also have this new surge of young, exciting teams. So you have Minnesota, who has a young prospect in Anthony Edwards, who's only 22 years old, but is just taking the league by storm. He could
That was
quite
I saw
possibly.
one of your articles, isn't it, with Anthony Edwards? Was
I think
in your eyes
the future of the league. Absolutely, yeah. It goes back to the whole they love an American player. He's the next great American player, I think. And obviously, they're playing against the former champions in the Nuggets, and that's been an interesting series to say the least. And then you have Oklahoma City and Dallas. Oklahoma City, the youngest team in the league, but were also number one in their conference in the regular
What's the
season.
average
So
age? Do you know?
I believe about 23, 24. They have a lot of guys in that 19 to 26 range. They don't have a lot of older players.
So
They're
is
incredibly
that an
young.
experienced coach, or is it a coach that's come from the college game more recently?
It's a guy who's been an assistant in the NBA for a few years. He's been there now with that group for about 4 or 5 years, and they've had a really quick build. They were at the bottom of the barrel a few years ago. Last year, they're in the playoff mix, and this year they skyrocketed to number one. The good thing about basketball is when you have one great player, your fortunes all of a sudden start to change. So, and
Yeah.
they have one great player. So,
Well, I mean, I love the psychology behind sports teams. Like to me, I just find it so fascinating. That again, the Last Dance documentary, again with the coaches. Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head, the coach. But
Phil
he
Jackson.
also,
Yeah.
yeah, Phil Jackson. So he also had brought in a guy called Jason Mumford.
Hmm.
You know Jason Mumford?
No, I don't.
So he was basically one of his coaches there, he's a psychological coach basically. And I read his book. I can't remember what it was called by this Jason Mumford character though, but he was mentioned in the Last Dance documentary because he was one of the main guys who basically got all the team to meditate. He got the whole team to meditate and to get them to working as one, to clear the head and to get into that flow zone more consistently and to get into it more accurately. His book's absolutely incredible of how meditation for him opened up sports and how it creates the best athletes in every domain. And he goes into a lot of how he got that to work within that Chicago Bulls team. And it is just incredible to see. And again, like you say, within a basketball team, because the team itself is so small, the players on the pitch, and you're all in close contact with each other non-stop, that tight-knit group, you get one player whose mentality is just different, and those fortunes turn around massively. It's unlikely to happen in football so much just because of the size of the squad and the size of the pitch, where one player can have an amazing impact, and every player does have that impact, but it's rare that a player stands head and shoulders above the rest enough to be able to have that impact. It does happen. At the moment, the biggest example of that, I'd say, would be Jude Bellingham.
Mm-hmm.
Jude Bellingham, whatever side he's in, he's just transforms into... he's a phenom. And obviously you've got the likes of Messi and Ronaldo, where just their ethereal presence of just being in the squad is enough to lift everyone up. But like you say, so if the team in the NBA has got a player that comes in, it's just going to me, it's so fascinating how that can happen. Change the whole fortunes.
Yeah, the player, obviously, it's only 5-on-5 at any given time. And once you get into the playoffs, a lot of teams are really only playing 7 or 8 guys, maybe 9 if you're ever really deep squad. So you compare that to football on the other side. It's just like everything's a little bit more segmented. It's like if you invest a lot of your money into your attacking play, which a lot of teams have done, but you neglect your back line, it's just kind of like, well, how you might elevate immediately, but at the end of the day, it's ultimately you have to have a well balanced squad. Whereas in the NBA, you can get by pretty far with just one fantastic player and a bunch of okay role players. Which is, I think some may argue that's what makes basketball not great. Other people like myself would argue that is what makes basketball a great sport. So it all depends on your perspective.
I think you're right. I think that's what makes basketball. I think that's what makes the draft work for basketball.
Yes.
The draft works for basketball because of that exact reason there, that one player can change the whole team. Don't believe it works so well for the NFL, where one player isn't as likely to have such a huge impact, barring the quarterback, obviously.
Yes. Yeah, it's like you'll see teams like they'll have a top 10 draft pick in the NFL. They pick an offensive lineman, which is generally prudent. You want to protect your quarterback, and offensive lineman is how you do that. Why not get a really good one in the draft? But people be like, "Oh, I never heard of this guy. How am I supposed to be excited about this guy who I'm never going to see on TV like that? They're not going to focus in on it, and it becomes a weird situation. Whereas in basketball, you get a top 3 pick and you get a superstar potential player, and it's like this is a guy who's going to change the franchise, and you could sell that hope, and again, it's what makes basketball unique versus other sports, and who's to say what's the right and what is wrong, but it just makes them all unique.
1 second. Earphones have just died.
AirPods gave out on you. It's all right.
Sorry, 1 second. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I hear you.
There we go. Sorry, my AirPods have just died on me. It's okay. I got some wide ones. No, I think it's a shame that basketball hasn't never really taken off properly in the UK. There's basketball courts everywhere. Just no one really is so incentivized to do it, because every basketball court in the UK has got goalposts underneath it. We often get at parks. You get these concrete parks, or in the middle of a park there'll be a little concrete section which has got walls. It's got a backboard. It's got a net, well, maybe not a net, but like a metal chain net, and the backboard there. But then underneath it there's a goal. So if you're there, you can play football or basketball. It's not one or the other, and it's not as prevalent, unfortunately.
Yeah, I remember a friend of mine. Who's into the UK scene and with the local leagues there. And he was like telling me stories about how this club team in London. I can't think of their team name for the life of me now, but how they've been doing really well in European competition and whatever, but there's like no funding. Yeah, I think like the ownership group from West Ham got into it and haven't really financially supported the club due to a lack of interest or something. It's very strange, and I do know. Like I know there's a lot of basketball fans in the UK, so it strikes me as odd why the sport, like you never expect to surpass football. Obviously, that's the sport everybody watches, but you would imagine that maybe it could potentially get a little bit better viewership. Uh, Obviously, Eastern Europe is kind of like where a lot of that fandom is. I think a lot of that comes down to producing some great players to follow as well. Right now, there's only one, I believe, English-born NBA player, and he actually plays for the Knicks. His OG Anunoby is his name, and I think he was born in the UK. And so,
Was he raised in the UK, or was he just born in
no,
the? Yeah,
I believe he was born there, lived there for a few years maybe, and then moved to the States afterwards. And yeah, so I wonder if that's part of it. Not having local products to really follow. If you're in Serbia, you could easily say, "Hey, I want to watch the Nuggets because Nikola Jokic plays there," and now you're into the NBA.
Yeah,
And
it only takes that one player to pave the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there have been a couple. Like I think Ben Gordon was born in the UK years ago. I think that there's been a couple. I can't think of any other bigger names right now, but you would hope that that changes eventually, and the sport can maybe take off a little bit more in the UK.
Well, on the other hand, though, NFL has taken off in universities, so equivalent to college, just as a sort of secondary sport to take at university as opposed to football, because every university has their own team. Football teams there's often so many different strings to each university, up down to maybe the fifth team, because that many players want to play. But then it's come almost kind of like a rebel sport to play is American football. I know I called it NFL, but American football has become like a rebellious sport to play, where you'll always get on campus people either with an American football or they were trying out ultimate frisbee, and it's just almost trying to get away from the normal, the football and whatever else you have. But I mean, the options are there. The UK is so good with funding for sport, so good. It's just wherever it takes us, and at the moment, football's just there, and it's there for everyone. I wish I had more of it upbringing in different sports, especially things that weren't necessarily ball sports.
Hmm.
especially with again the prevalence of combat sports now. Combat sports in the US and in the wider world are just taking over, and as a spectator sport, I love it. I've done a little bit of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and by a little bit, I mean a little bit. But I've been to watch the UFC when it was in London, and I watch it on TV all the time, and it's just as a spectator sport, it's incredible. But it's something that wasn't there for me as an option to get into.
The interesting thing to me about MMA and the UFC is it just highlights to me how bad boxing fumbled everything, because
Yeah,
boxing had that whole combat sport thing, pretty locked up. But with all the mismanagement, the thing that the UFC did right is they formed the entity that all that stuff happened under, right? Obviously, you have other mixed martial arts type of organizations and affiliate groups and all that, but they're the big one, obviously. And boxing never had that. Everything was independent. Everything was promoters and stuff. And now the sport is dying, and it's made way with elements of it incorporated to mixed martial arts. And yeah, they've done a fantastic job of because it's tough, because it's violent, it's bloody. The early days of UFC were kind of wild with before they had weight classes and divisions and stuff like that. And they've come a really long way. And I think a lot of team sports, they gotta be careful, because I do believe that MMA with a younger generation, especially, is resonating more than a lot of team sports are. So, like a sport like hockey, a sport like baseball, I think they got to be on a little bit of alert, because a lot of younger fans, Gen Z and below, are kind of gravitating to MMA, also gravitating to esports, as well. And I think that poses a real problem for those sports.
well, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who's massive into the UFC, but his background was boxing. And I see a massive opportunity at the moment for a company like DAZN. I don't know if you know DAZN, have it out in the US.
Yeah,
DAZN is buying up a lot of boxers, and they're putting on a lot of their own cards on their own subscription-based model, similar to the UFC in that regard. And they have an opportunity now to do exactly what the UFC did with how they structure the leagues, how they structure opponents, how they structure the narrative of fighters, but with boxing, all under one name, as opposed to the greedy promoters ruining the sport for everybody else, where a boxer might not fight for 2 years just
yeah.
because they can't get the right deal, or because of the building up press, where for as good as boxing was formerly because of that, UFC coming in and putting it all under one house, all under one name. Yes, it's not perfect, with especially the brand deals and the how much the fighters get paid. But in terms of as a spectator sport, it's incredible. You can follow that sport. You can follow the narrative. You can follow who's going to fight who. You can do UFC math to try and find out who's in what position to do what, and it almost works to an extent. And you got a much better, and you've got a good timeline for it as well. You're not waiting months and months on end for a decent fight, which could turn out to be a flop, and it could turn out to be boring. The card could be awful unless you're unless you're actually truly into boxing. You're not going to get that. Where DAZN are, whether they're going to do it or not, I've not heard anything, but I see them as primed to take that stance, to be the UFC of boxing.
And that's what boxing's needed all along, and like boxing as a sport is interesting. It's just the politics around boxing and the promoters and the lack of regularity, and the fact that they've leaned in way too heavily on these kind of like uh, just these things. They're focusing on the name draw more than anything else, more than the sport itself, and what makes it so interesting of a sport, I think, has really hurt them. And having an entity that kind of organizes all of that stuff makes a lot of sense. And it's something that I hope they do, because I think it's a shame what's happened to boxing. It's kind of faded into obscurity. Only, like you mentioned, the most diehard boxing fans are the ones who are watching boxing. Most of the more casual fans who would pay for a $50 pay-per-view when Mike Tyson was in his prime have now pivoted over to UFC. And they'll give Dana White those pay-per-view dollars, right? And be completely content because some UFC fighters use a lot of boxing elements in addition to different martial arts trainings and disciplines, and it's a good product. There's no debating that.
I mean, if it is, it's a perfect product. It works so well. It's got its flaws, and the only issue with the UFC at the moment that I can see, not in terms of UFC, just MMA fighting in general, is that the way that they put that narrative together for the fighters, and as you say, styles make fights. Because of that, it isn't really a true competition because they can almost select who they want to be in what position based off what they are tailoring towards. And for the UFC, it's as much as the ground game could be incredible, they always want those knockouts. They want those knockouts. They want those thrilling, one punch, gone, out cold, what the fuck just happened moments. And boxing's always had that. It's always been primed for that. Boxing doesn't have that in the lower weight classes, which is why no one really knows what's going on or cares as much other than when, say for yourselves, Deontay Wilder was fighting. And for us, we've got obviously Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, and Usyk as well in the round Jura. Other than the big names in the heavyweight divisions, no one really knows too much about what's going on. Where this is the extent this conversation went for me and my friend. It was, right, if DAZN bought up all these fighters and they created a competition where everyone's going to get regular fights, they're going to get paid well, they're going to reduce the weight of the gloves, especially for the lighter weight fighters to increase the probability of a knockout, you've got an absolute spectacle right there. Right there. And boxing as a sport is crying out for it. Crying out for it.
They're begging for a rejuvenation, ultimately. And they got to do something, and I hope DAZN follows through with that because I think it's no good not having the option of boxing, and it's not been viable, I don't think, since the year 2000, to be quite honest. And it's a sport that's been on life support for far too long, and it needs a company to really steer it into the right direction. And I think DAZN could do that. They're a viable entity. Obviously, they're relevant here in the U.S. as well, and I think they can make some headway with it because I think there's an appetite for it. We've seen an appetite for combat sports in general. Boxing, of course, becomes pitched maybe as a specialized one. Obviously not as wide ranging as MMA and UFC are. So that I think there would be an audience for it again, and I'm hoping to see that through.
Yeah, me too. But anyway, though, Omar, we've been going on for quite a while, and I could talk to you endlessly about sports. I've missed that being out here in Australia. Australian sport's not quite the same. Can't quite get into it as much.
yeah, I bet.
But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your insights, from your ideas, your way of thinking, in terms of how you feel the game goes, how it is at the moment, and your takes on it. And I love reading your stuff on Medium, the audience you've created for yourself as well, based off your opinions and what you could see as the future of the sport, whether it does things right, does things wrong. It's invaluable to this generation.
I appreciate that, Bailey. I appreciate you giving me so much time to talk to you. It's been a pleasure. Been a pleasure just connecting, chatting, and all that. And appreciate the kind words about my little ramblings on Medium. I'm glad to hear that it has a somewhat positive impact on.
Of course, and again, for everybody else, where can people find you?
Yeah, of course. So you can catch me on Medium at medium.com/@Omar Zahran. You can catch me on social media on X/Twitter at Omar.zhrn. Instagram, same handle as well. If you don't pay for Medium and you still want my articles, you could subscribe to Substack, deepcover.substack.com, for all that stuff. So a lot, and on the Substack, you could also have quick access to the podcast that I do under that Deep Cover brand name. So still pretty new into it. Just recorded my 11th episode of that one today. So definitely check all that out as well.
But that's awesome.